Welcome to Beyond Our Paradise, which is made by What Could It Be? In this documentary, we will present an alternative view on history and current events, starting off with Trump and the American Embassy in Jerusalem, followed by the history of Judaism and the mistreatment of its followers. We will then cover the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Next, we will talk about the control Zionists have over the world, followed by the money system and how it is used to put everybody in debt. We will then talk about the overthrowing of governments who do not have a Rothschild central bank. The attacks on freedom of speech and its importance are up next. We will then go back in time and talk about the First World War. Then the years between the world wars, in which Germany turned into a superpower, followed by the war that would be the downfall of the Third Reich, the Second World War. Next up is the Allied revenge against Germany during and after the Second World War. And next, eugenics, which is the persecution of unwanted people. We will then touch on the Transgender Agenda and its place in the world today. And political correctness, which is one of the biggest threats to freedom of speech. Finally, we will cover the imprisonment of unwanted people in concentration camps worldwide. And the Milgram experiment, which is a study on the impact of authority on obedience.
When I came into office, I promised to look at the world's challenges with open eyes and very fresh thinking. We cannot solve our problems by making the same failed assumptions and repeating the same failed strategies of the past. Old challenges demand new approaches.
On December the 6th, 2017, we heard in the news that the US had made the decision to move its embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. President Trump has the right, however, to make whatever foreign policy he wants, and if he feels that Miami Beach is the best place to recognize as the capital of Israel, that's his business. He can do it, but once he starts talking about the Jewish people, he's encroaching upon religion.
We will move the American embassy to the eternal capital of the Jewish people, Jerusalem.
President Trump, thank you for today's historic decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. The Jewish people and the Jewish state will be forever grateful.
Moving the embassy to Jerusalem is in violation of the UN resolution and in disregard for the wants of any other nation in the world. It reveals that Donald Trump is working to inflate global conflict. It is also a statement openly supporting the genocide of the Palestinian people and the theft of the remaining Palestinian land by the State of Israel. This should leave no doubts in anybody's mind what Trump's real agenda is and who Trump is really playing for. He is certainly not playing for world peace. He's not playing for the Jewish or for the American people. He seems to be playing solely for the State of Israel, the ultra-Zionists. While many people had hoped that Donald Trump was the outsider he claimed to be, it is becoming more and more clear that he is not. Like everyone else before him, as well as after him, our politicians are controlled as puppets by ultra-Zionists and Rothschild Zionists. People with just a little knowledge about our world have known for decades about fake news being presented in the mainstream media. Trump has used this fake news term cleverly. It means he can now use this card for whatever is being said or revealed about him. He will just claim it's fake news. Zionism is not about race, and you don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist. It is a political movement that hides behind the religion of Judaism. Many Christians and non-Jews worldwide are supporters of this movement. And at its core, it's a secret society that moves as one unit towards global power.
There is I used to say early on when I was a kid, I'd say, when I was a young senator, I'd say, if I were a Jew, I'd be a Zionist. I am a Zionist. You don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist.
What the move of Trump is going to do is give an enormous amount of confidence to the state of Israel, and Israel will use this to kickstart more aggression. Israel can get away with this, because Israel is the eternal victim of the Holocaust that they hold over the minds of everybody. Everybody believes that the Israelites must be allowed to do whatever they want to do. This is what gives credibility to the state of Israel and causes Zionist puppets like Donald Trump to support this stolen state, which is not governed by real Jewish people, but governed by ultra-Zionists who are masquerading as Jews. The American people have paid a high price for the alliance with Israel. This includes tens of billions in economic and military aid, hundreds of billions that the Iraq war and occupation has cost, and the deaths of many American soldiers. Directly and indirectly, the so-called special relationship with Israel has also generated unprecedented distrust, fear and loathing of the US around the world. By supporting Israel and its policies, the US betrays not only its own national interests, but also the principles it claims to embody and defend. Dov Sekheim, Zionist, was the financial controller of the Pentagon. He labeled a lot of weaponry and planes in America as scrap, when they weren't scrap, but this way they could be passed to Israel. For instance, Israel has the second biggest F-16 fleet in the world, the biggest outside of America. John Mearsheimer and Stephen Wall produced a book called The Israel Lobby and US Foreign Policy, and they wrote, quote, Israel receives about $3 billion in direct foreign assistance each year, which is roughly 1/5 of America's entire foreign aid budget. In per capita terms, the United States gives each Israeli a direct subsidy worth about $500 per year. This largesse is especially striking when one realizes that Israel is now a wealthy industrial state. End quote.
I'm a little baby. I'm so sad. Feed me more money.
Israel is America's spoiled child. Why is it that the US stands out amongst the world's nations in such support for the Zionist state? The US continues, as it has for years, to provide Israel with crucial military, financial and diplomatic backing. One person who has spoken about the real reason why the US supports Israel is Desmond Tutu of South Africa, who was awarded the 1984 Nobel Peace Prize. Addressing an audience in Boston, he said, quote, "But you know as well as I do that somehow the Israeli government is placed on a pedestal in the US, and to criticize it is to be immediately dubbed anti-Semitic. People are scared in this country. To say wrong is wrong because this lobby is powerful." End quote. Many ultra-Zionists have infiltrated Trump's inner circle. His daughter Ivanka Trump is married to a Zionist, Jared Kushner, who also works as Trump's advisor, notably on the Middle East and Israel issues. A former journalist, Philip Weiss, who worked with Kushner 10 years ago, explains that Kushner indeed is a Zionist, and Philip wrote this, quote, "My interactions with Jared were limited, but they don't give me much hope about his ability to achieve peace in the Middle East." End quote. Jared Kushner said in April 2017 that he became incredibly well informed on the Middle East by reading up on the region while waiting for the ski lift on a recent trip to Aspen. Quote, "There would be times when you'd have to wait 5 or even 10 minutes for the ski lift, and that's when I take out my phone and read up on the Middle East," he said. "I really got into it." End quote. Kushner's wife, Ivanka Trump, said that her husband's ability to learn so much about the Middle East while waiting for the ski lift was, quote, "nothing short of amazing." End quote. Jared Kushner does have great insider knowledge of the situation in the Middle East. Not only is he an ultra-Zionist himself, but he has been a lifelong friend of the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu is also a ultra-Zionist, claiming to represent the Jewish people. But how can he claim this? Firstly, he's not a practicing Jew, and secondly, he can't represent the world's Jewry as Prime Minister from Israel, although Zionism is trying hard to promote the word Jew as a person from Israel.
For example, Naftali Bennett wrote on his website that any insult to Benjamin Netanyahu, in context he was talking about the president, is an insult to all the Jews all over the world. Reason being is because Netanyahu is not merely the Prime Minister of Israel, he's this is what he said, the leader of Jews all over the world. Netanyahu has no right to claim that his state is mine. I was born in America, my father was born in Poland, my mother's family is from England. We have nothing to do with Israel. We're Jews. We're observant Jews. We're religious Jews.
In truth, if the US would hold Israel to the same standards that it has applied to Iraq, Serbia and other countries, American bombers would be blasting Tel Aviv and American officials would be putting Israeli leaders behind bars for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Some people believe that Israel is not the homeland of the Jewish people, but that it's the fiefdom of the Rothschild dynasty, created out of Rothschild Zionism, a secret society to massively contribute to the manipulation and control of our global society and individual countries. They own our news, media, oil, our government, and you have probably never heard about them. The Rothschild family is worth $500 trillion. They own nearly every central bank in the world, and they have financed both sides of most wars since Napoleon. Nathan Rothschild funded Wellington's army, and Jacob Rothschild funded Napoleon's army in the Battle of Waterloo. Don't forget that we for a long time have had many Jews living in Palestine without any problems. The problem started when Zionists laid claim on Israel. They created terrorist groups like Irgun and the Stern Gang, and they started doing horrific terrorist acts to terrify the Palestine people. And, in the end, their grotesque action led to about 800,000 Palestine people leaving their homeland in terror. What we then had was the establishment of Israel in part of Palestine, but that was never how it was meant to end. It was a process of constant aggression until they had the entire land and created this greater Israel, which they claimed God gave to Abraham in the Old Testament. Abram promised the land from the river in Egypt, the Nile, crossed to the Euphrates. That includes parts of Syria, Iraq and Jordan and other countries. Menachem Begin was an Israeli politician and founder of Likud, and the 6th Prime Minister of Israel, and before the creation of the State of Israel, he was the leader of the ultra-Zionist militant terror group Irgun. As Prime Minister, he condemned the terrorism of others. It's double moral when Israeli politicians and leaders are condemning terrorism and say they only want peace. But, at the same time, they create terrorist organizations themselves. Israel has never wanted peace, as it has always done the opposite. Israel is an apartheid society, not just between Israelis and Palestinians, but throughout Israel's society. It's grotesque the way they treat black Jewish people from Ethiopia. And at the same time, spokesmen funded by ultra-Zionism talk about the racism of others. Ultra-Zionists have created several boogeymen. One is called the Muslim Brotherhood, which has an interesting background. Britain and America established the Muslim Brotherhood after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1924, and the Muslim Brotherhood is still owned by the same crowd to this day. Israel is now among one of the major sponsors of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was involved in the founding of another boogeyman called Hamas. So, by sponsoring these terror groups, Israel has an excuse to not negotiate, which gives them more time to finish their job of Palestinian genocide. Every time there's any chance of a peace agreement, which would commit Israel to an outcome that it doesn't want, Hamas or the Muslim Brotherhood will carry out a terrorist attack, or Mossad does. Mossad is the National Intelligence Agency of Israel, and this is used as an excuse to end negotiations. Israel orders its agents in Hamas to start firing their military equipment of peace shooters at Israel, thereby justifying the state-of-the-art bombing and mass murder of Palestinians in retaliation. Thanks to the US, Britain and others, Israel has a superior military with advanced weaponry, so when surrounding countries invaded or attempted to invade, the full might of the Israeli military has pushed it all back into those countries and took it over. It's like taking candy from kids. Charles Freeman, former US ambassador to Saudi Arabia, says that Israel started Hamas. It was a project of Shin Bet, the Israel Domestic Intelligence Agency, which had a feeling that they could use it to hem in the PLO, PLO being the Palestine Liberation Organization. David Shipler, reporter from the New York Times, quotes the Israeli military governor of Gaza, quote, "Israel financed Islamic fundamentalists to oppose the PLO," end quote. Israeli military governor of the Gaza Strip, Brigadier General Yitzhak Segev, once told that the Israeli government had financed the Islamic movement to counteract the PLO and the communists. Politically speaking, Islamic fundamentalists were sometimes regarded as useful to Israel because they had conflicts with the secular supporters of the PLO. Violence between the two groups erupted occasionally. Yasser Arafat, the leader of the PLO, told an Italian newspaper that Hamas is a creation of Israel, which at the time of Prime Minister Shamir, whom by the way was a terrorist, gave them money and more than 700 institutions, among them schools, universities and mosques. Arafat said that the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin had told him in the presence of Egypt's former President Mubarak that Israel had supported Hamas. When you think that the whole relation of Israel has been created on a gigantic historical lie,
then what else are they lying about? Everything. And when you come from that perspective, then you start seeing what is happening in the world. Quote, David Icke.
Keep in mind that we're not attacking Jewish people in these videos. Those we're talking about are the ultra-Zionists and the Rothschild Zionists, who still to this day are ruling our world. Jewish people are its victims, not its beneficiaries. Jewish people have been hung out again and again by this crowd, who claim to have their best interest at heart, but they don't. Jewish people are just a piece in the puzzle as well. People tend to think that Zionism is a reaction to anti-Semitism, a way to protect Jewish people, but this is not true. Zionism doesn't have the goal of defeating anti-Semitism, because if anti-Semitism disappeared today, Zionism would still continue. Many Jewish people don't want to be compared with Zionism, and many innocent Jewish people have been victims of Zionism, but that's not something we see in the news. Because of its propaganda, we equate Zionism with Jewish people, but that's not how it is. There are many brave Jewish people in Israel who are resisting Zionism. Young people who go to jail because they won't serve in the army because of what the army does to the Palestinians, but this is never given much attention in the media. There are less than 2% Jewish people in America, and less than this percentage are Zionists and supporters of Zionism. Even less would be attached to the secret society level of Rothschild ultra-Zionism. The people at this level are not representative of the Jewish people. We want to make clear that when we mention Zionists, we are not pointing at all Zionists in the world, but only the very few, the ultra-Zionists and the Rothschild Zionists who are controlling our world. The widely accepted start of Zionism was just after the French Revolution. During the French Revolution, a monarchy was overthrown, a republic was born, and the Jewish people, for the first time, got the same rights as every other French citizen. Like in France, the British Jews acquired this update in law in 1856, and the German Jews got it in 1871. It's odd that the Jewish people didn't have the same human rights as everybody else, but, for all we can see, it seems as the Jewish people has been the target of hatred in Europe for a long time. In the 17th century, many Jewish people were forced to live in ghettos and were hunted and denied access to countries. The horror the Jewish people have faced is almost unimaginable. In 1918, a series of anti-Jewish riots spread over Europe. These riots were known as Heb riots. Jewish schools were vandalized, their shops looted, windows smashed, homes attacked, and Jews themselves physically abused. Some of the hatred was because many people believed that the Jewish people as a whole were responsible for the death of Jesus Christ. The anti-Semitic slur, Christ killer, was used by mobs to incite violence against Jews and contributed to many centuries of slaughter, like the murder of Jews during the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, and during the Holocaust. But then, all of a sudden, after the French Revolution, the Jewish people were no longer restricted by law. They were able to fully participate in any activity they wanted. Whether it was in the fields of sports, science, or industry, the Jews could now acquire wealth and fame like any other person. This led to a problem, as Jewish people are a people of faith. Jews were supposed to live by the teachings of God and study the Torah. Several Jewish people strayed from their God, as they wanted to participate in the matters of the common man. Religious Jews wanted to stay true to their teachings and didn't want to follow this faction, which led to tension. To understand what makes a Jew, we need to understand that Jews are not a race and also not a tribe. You cannot convert to a race, but you can convert to a religion. A Jew is simply a person that follows Judaism, the Torah. The early Zionists came up with a plan. In order to stay Jewish but still participate in the world, they had to push the religious Jews out of their religious corner and into the open. They wanted to turn Jews into so-called, quote, normal people. According to Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, the Zionists view themselves as a cure to Judaism. What the ultra-Zionists did towards their fellow Jews has happened in history before. We came across some interesting stories from the ancient time of the Roman Empire. A rebel group called the Sicarii were a splinter group of Jewish zealots. They were the most fanatical, ruthless, and terrifying Jewish sect in the revolt. Their leader, Menachem, had been waiting for the Jews to rise up against their Roman conquerors. His grandfather, his father, and 2 brothers had all been killed by the Romans. He was consumed by hatred for the Roman Empire. What is interesting is that instead of uniting against Rome, it seems the Sicarii also turned their anger and weapons towards their fellow Jews, who they saw as weak people, who needed to be destroyed. This way, the Sicarii rebels were looking at Jews sounds very similar to the behavior we have seen from ultra-Zionism. Some of the most offensive quotes against Jews came from no one else but from the early Zionists. They harassed religious Jews and even sided with anti-Semitism. The early Zionists became the opposite of the Judaic Jews. They wanted to be fighters, while Jews are a people of peace. They wanted to be physically strong, while Jews wanted to use words. These early Zionists wanted to be the perfect people by the standards of the common man. The early Zionists took their ideas from several nationalistic movements. Evangelical Christians also had a part in the creation of early Zionism. The ultra-Zionist Ben-Gurion once said that he did not believe in God, and yet he went to the British government to proclaim that God had promised Israel to the Jews. Why did he do this? While Ben-Gurion may not have believed in God, the British certainly did, and thereby he won their support. Here we can spot another opposite. Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro says, quote, Jews make promises to God, unquote. And you can see that according to Ben-Gurion, God makes, quote, promises to the Zionist, unquote. The Rothschild family was the main creator of Zionism, but the public face for this movement was Theodor Herzl, with his book called The Jewish State, that he wrote in 1896. Theodor Herzl claimed to have the legal right to represent the world's Jews. He invoked a Roman law that dictates, quote, if you're not here, he will represent you, unquote. So therefore, he could speak for all Jews. Herzl claimed that the only solution to the increasing restrictions on Jews and the increasing anti-Semitism was that Jews set up an independent Jewish state. The first Zionist conference was held in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland. Zionism focused from 1917 on establishing a state in present Israel. Its first positive result arose when the English government issued the Balfour Declaration on November 2, 1917. This false representation of the Jewish people continues to this day. Atheists are running Israel, from Ben-Gurion all the way up to Netanyahu, while using the Bible as an excuse for the ownership of the land. This is all an ultra-Zionist thing. The Zionist plan is to turn the Jew from a person with a religious belief into a person with a national background, that of Israel. The next step is centralization, make Israel the nation-state of the Jews. However, many Jews were born in other countries, and they don't feel they have anything to do with Israel, apart from the connection they will always have with Jerusalem as their holy city. But it doesn't matter who occupies it. Shlomo Sand wrote a book in 2013 about the invention of the land of Israel. He questions if there was ever this ancient Jewish nation at all. When the Palestinian problem escalated after June 1967, Zionism grew with growing international criticism, which appeared in the UN General Assembly Resolution 3379 in 1975. With 72 votes in favor and 35 against, the General Assembly decided that, quote, Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination, end quote. Former Israeli Minister Shalomit Aloni, the anti-Semitic trick.
People here are called anti-Semitic. What is your response to that as an Israeli Jew?
Well, it's a trick. We always use it. When from Europe somebody is criticizing Israel, then we bring up the Holocaust. When in this country people are criticizing Israel, then they are anti-Semitic. And the organization is strong and has a lot of money.
Even Jewish people suffer from this anti-Semitic term. If a Jewish person expresses criticism over the Israeli government, they are called a self-hating Jew, as they can be labeled anti-Semitic. In 1977, Zionism swapped from the left to the right wing. They started to use logic, quote, everybody is against us. Israel is the only thing between Jews and another Holocaust, end quote. Whenever Israel goes to war, anti-Semitism goes up. Innocent Jewish people, not even linked to Israel, get targeted because of this. What is happening now is that Jews are kept in constant fear with this logic. They are pushed into the Zionist domain. Zionists rely on anti-Semitism to further their goals. Studies show that during times of increased anti-Semitism, immigration to Israel increases. If Jewish immigration stops or even slows, it is estimated that within a decade the Jewish population in Israel will be a minority. So, the ultra-Zionists need to encourage anti-Semitism in order for Jews to leave their homeland and seek refuge in Israel. But is Israel really a haven and a safe place to be for Jewish people? It seems to only be the case if they are praising Zionism and don't ask questions about the Israeli government. According to the Diaspora Affairs Ministry statistics, there are currently 14.4 million Jews in the world, with 6.3 million in Israel and the rest spread out over the globe. This term has also reached the universities by suggesting that the officials who govern California's public universities should abandon language that criticizes Israel. A letter signed in 2016 by more than 130 UC faculty members supported naming anti-Zionism as an expression of anti-Semitism. It is such a mess when even our educations get these terms wrong, but then again, who is behind our education system? The term Semitic doesn't refer to a race, but it refers to a language group, and that language group overwhelmingly consists of people and nations from what we today call Arab. However, the word anti-Semitic means hostile to or prejudiced against Jews. Anti-Semitic is a made-up thing to speak against the corrupt current state of Israel. The other term, Anti-Zionism, is not anti-Semitism, because Zionism is not about Jewish people. It is a political system, a political philosophy, and in its core, it is a secret society putting its agents in places of power. And to shut people up, the Rothschild Zionists have created organizations like ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. The mission of ADL is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment for all. They set these organizations up to target those people who are saying things as we are presenting here. The idea is to throw racists at people to shut them up and discredit them. As a result, when you criticize Israel, you're promoted to criticizing Jewish people, and therefore you're a racist. Likewise, the world's politicians are being played like a violin by these people. If the politician doesn't support the ultra-Zionists, these Zionists will make sure the Jewish people in that country won't support that politician. Most people won't touch this topic, but we have to stop running away from this in fear. All the information is out there, and no one should be jailed for researching our history. So it's important to learn the difference between a Jewish person and a Zionist, and more precisely an ultra-Zionist, and that you understand the history behind it and understand how our governments were formed and corrupted by ultra-Zionists, and that you also understand how the media is controlled by ultra-Zionists. Cass Sunstein, Zionist, who has written a paper in January 2015 that called for the ban on conspiracy theorizing, saying that people who have conspiracies should either be banned or taxed from expressing them. Today, conspiracy theorists are labeled nutheads with tinfoil hats on, and people who believe in all conspiracies out there. The term conspiracy theory has been misused, especially in the media and movies, to discredit anyone who questions our government and our society. A conspiracy can be a secret between two people, and as we know humanity, everyone is having secrets. So how can anyone claim that conspiracies don't exist? There are conspiracies everywhere, from small to large. Lance de Haven Smith has suggested that the term was deployed in the 1960s by the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, to discredit John F. Kennedy assassination conspiracy theories. Half the billionaires in the world are Zionists. The 3 major television networks and the 4 largest film studios are run by ultra-Zionists, as are the owners of the nation's largest newspaper chain, which is the single most influential newspaper, the New York Times. In October 2007, Vanity Fair magazine in the United States published a list of what it calls the world's most powerful people, a lineup of the most influential media bosses, bankers, publishers, image makers, and so forth, who determine how we view ourselves and the world, and, directly and indirectly, shape our lives and our futures. Zionists made up over half of the Vanity Fair list, reported leading Israeli newspaper, the Jerusalem Post. One member of the influential Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations estimated Zionists alone contributed 50% of the funds for President Bill Clinton's campaign in 1996. The American magazine Mother Jones compiled a listing of the 400 leading contributors to the US national elections in the year 2000. 7 out of the first 10 were Zionists. In recent years, the single biggest donor to the American politicians has been the Israeli billionaire and media mogul Haim Saban. In January 2007, it was revealed that he had donated approximately $13 million to various American candidates. Joel Stein, a columnist for the Los Angeles Times, has written, quote, "As a proud Jew, I want America to know of our accomplishments. Yes, we control Hollywood. I don't care if Americans think we control the news, media, Hollywood, Wall Street, or the government. I only care that we keep running them." End quote. Over the years, the ultra-Zionists have had a profound impact on how Americans feel, think and act, and one prominent American who has publicly acknowledged this reality is Vice President Joe Biden. In May 2013, he said, quote, "The immense and outsized Jewish role in the mass media and cultural life is the single most important factor in shaping American attitudes over the past century and in driving major cultural and political changes." Biden also said, "I bet you 85% of those social political changes, whether in Hollywood or social media, are a consequence of Jewish leaders in the industry. The influence is immense." He went on to say, "Jewish heritage has shaped who we are, all of us, much more than any other factor in the last 223 years. End quote. And what Joe Biden also means is of course not Jewish people, but he's talking about ultra-Zionism. A group of so-called neoconservative Zionists played a key role into plotting the US into a war with Iraq. They included Paul Wolfowitz, Deputy Secretary of Defense, Richard Perle, Chairman of the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board, David Wurmser of the State Department, and Douglas J. Feith, the Pentagon's Undersecretary for Policy. These men acted in accord with ultra-Zionist plans to overthrow the Iraqi regime that was already in place well before President Bush came to office in early 2001. Tam Dalyell, a British Labour Party deputy known as the Father of the House because he was the longest serving member of parliament, said, quote, "A Jewish cabal has taken over the government in the United States. There's far too much Jewish influence in the United States." End quote. Tam Dalyell is talking about the ultra-Zionists and not about the Jewish people. In Washington, D.C., Senator Ernest Hollings was moved to declare that Iraq was invaded to secure Israel. He also said that, quote, "Nobody's willing to stand up and say what's going on." He continues, "Members of Congress, with few exceptions, uncritically support Israel and its policies due to the pressure that we get politically." End quote. Influential ultra-Zionist organizations, such as the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, insists that the US must recognize and defend Israel as a specifically Jewish ethnic religious state, which Donald Trump just has confirmed. Shahar Ilan, a daily features editor with the leading Israeli newspaper, Har Haaretz, wrote, quote, "The Jews do control the American media. Claiming otherwise is an insult to common knowledge." End quote. The Federal Reserve, despite its name, is not run by the federal government. In fact, it's a privately owned institute, a consortium of ultra-Zionist owned and associated banks, with the Rothschilds at its head, including the Morgans and the Rockefellers.
What is the proper relationship, what should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take.
The Rothschilds, the Morgans, and the other ultra-Zionists are very clever people. Not only do they control if our economy goes up or down, but they also sell themselves as economy advisors to governments to help the countries make wise decisions. Most, if not all, of the international banks are controlled by the Rothschilds, including the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the European Central Bank. Goldman Sachs is also controlled by the Rothschilds. It's an American multinational finance company that engages in global investment banking, investment management, securities, and other financial services. Not only are most of the big international banks owned by the Rothschilds, also all of the central banks in each country are owned by the Rothschilds. A central bank in any country is an institution that produces the currency for an entire nation. Two specific powers are inherent in central banking practice: the control of interest rates and the control of the money supply, or inflation. The central bank does not simply supply a government's economy of money, it loans it out to them at interest. Then, through the use of increasing and decreasing the supply of money, the central bank regulates the value of the currency being issued. It is critical to understand that the entire structure of the system can only produce one thing in the long run: debt. It does not take a lot of ingenuity to figure this scam out, because every single dollar produced by the central bank is loaned at interest. That means every single dollar produced is actually that dollar plus a certain percent of debt based on that dollar. And since the central bank has a monopoly over the production of the currency for the entire country, and they loan each dollar out with immediate debt attached to it, where does the money to pay for the debt come from? It can only come from the central bank again, which means the central bank has to perpetually increase its money supply to temporarily cover the outstanding debt created, which in turn, since that new money is loaned out at interest as well, creates even more debt. The end result of this system is slavery, because it is impossible for the government and thus the public to ever come out of the self-generating debt. Now, the control of the economy and the perpetual robbery of wealth is only one side of the Rubik's Cube that the bankers hold in their hands. The next tool for profit and control is war. It is important to understand that the most lucrative thing to happen for the international bankers is war. It forces more money to be borrowed by the country at interest. The first step in having a central bank established in a country is to get them to accept outrageous loans, which puts the country in debt of the central bank and under the control of the Rothschild Zionists. The Rothschild family is slowly but surely having their central banks established in every country, giving them an incredible amount of power and wealth. On a little side note, the Rothschilds could use this power to eliminate all nations' debt, to feed every starving mouth, to provide everyone with clean water, and effectively to end all wars by removing the funding of it. All the world's currencies are fiat currencies. Historically, most currencies were based on physical commodities such as gold or silver. But fiat money is based solely on faith. The government just declares they have value, and as long as the people keep believing this, they do have value. But here's the thing. There have been thousands upon thousands of fiat currencies throughout history, and they have all failed. But there's a vast difference this time around. Since 1971, for the very first time in history, all the world's currencies are fiat currencies, simultaneously. In the year of 2000, there were 8 countries without a Rothschild-owned or controlled central bank. These were Afghanistan, Iraq, Sudan, Libya, Cuba, North Korea, Iran, and Syria. The rest of the world is controlled by the Rothschild central banks. The same year, a group called the Project for the New American Century, PNAC, produced a document that listed a series of countries they wanted to regime change. They also spoke about having the United States fight in, quote, multiple theater wars, end quote, to accomplish this goal. The countries listed in this document were basically the same 8 countries we listed above. PNAC's goal is to promote American global leadership. Coming back to the claim that it doesn't matter who's living in the White House, over these 20 years there were 3 different administrations, both Republican and Democrat. They all had the same objective. They were all controlled by the same hidden hand. We are now going to show how these countries without a Rothschild central bank fared during the last 2 decades. The first president to be in power during this time was George W. Bush. The Bush administration was dominated and controlled by the neocons, which were a Rothschild organization. His speechwriter was David Frum, a Zionist. He was a man who made the quote, "axis of evil." This quote was often repeated throughout Bush's presidency to describe governments that the US accused of sponsoring terrorism and seeking weapons of mass destruction. Iran, Iraq, and North Korea were portrayed as such governments by the US. Do note that these countries are also on the to-be-conquered list. The notion of such an axis was used to pinpoint these common enemies of the United States and rally the American people in support of the war on terror. The single biggest event in Bush's presidency was 9/11. This attack on America is still surrounded in conspiracies. Not only do a lot of events during 9/11 not add up, the events before did neither. Just weeks before the attack, the lease of the World Trade Center was purchased by Larry Silverstein and Frank Lowy. This deal was done with Louis Eisenberg, head of the New York Port Authority. All these men are alleged Zionists. The suspicion around 9/11 continued during the investigations. Not only was a lot of information kept secret, but when the report came out, big parts were questioned by outside professionals who claimed that mistakes had been made. The 9/11 investigation was led by the head of the CIA, George Tenet. The 9/11 Commission report was written by Philip Zelikow. This was the official report investigating 9/11. Like the people investigating 9/11, Judge Alvin Hellerstein is also an alleged Zionist. He was hearing and overseeing the cases of the 9/11 families. Following the events of 9/11, the head of the Justice Department's Criminal Division, Michael Chertoff, helped craft the Patriot Act, the law that extended the federal government's authority to conduct mass surveillance. Michael's mother was a Mossad agent. And let's not forget about the missing 2.3 trillion which they announced on September the 10th, 2001, the day before 9/11.
Pentagon, the day before 9/11.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
Releasing a very important document just the day before the headlines of the news will be stolen away by one of the biggest events ever seems a bit suspicious. We don't know the exact numbers of the missing dollars from the Pentagon, as there seems to be variations between $6 and $10 trillion. As late as 2016, a new Department of Defense Inspector General's report reveals the Pentagon couldn't account for $6.5 trillion worth of Army General Fund transactions and data, according to a report by the Fiscal Times. The 9/11 event allowed the United States to invade Afghanistan. This marks the start of crossing out all the countries on the list for regime change. The next country to be removed was Iraq. Iraq was invaded with the false claims of having weapons of mass destruction. However, these weapons were never found. We're not claiming the Iraq regime was good to its people, but they did get invaded for fraudulent reasons. Not only were both these countries not owned by Rothschild central banks, Iraq is the number 4 in oil production, and Afghanistan is the number 1 in opium production, supplying 90% of the world's heroin. After Bush, Obama became president. Obama continued the occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq. He ticked Libya off the list and tried to get Syria as well. Unfortunately for the ultra-Zionists, Vladimir Putin stepped in and blocked this. Not only did Obama continue the ultra-Zionist conquest outside of the United States, he also strengthened their grip inside the United States. Obama nominated Ellen Keegan to the position of Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States and was later confirmed by the United States Senate. Zionists are now making up nearly half of the Supreme Court. Obama's handler was Rahm Emanuel, and he served in the Israeli army. His father was a terrorist in the Irgun terrorist group that bombed Israel into existence in 1948. Henry Kissinger, a Rothschild Zionist, was an advisor to Obama. The entire Obama budget was run by Peter Orszag, also an alleged Zionist. As one can imagine, the main founder of Obama was of course an ultra-Zionist, George Soros. During the end of the Obama administration, and now with the Trump administration, the hidden powers look at Iran. Iran is under a lot of international pressure from the American media and government. But America and Israel cannot just walk into every country they want. People will start asking questions, so they have to come up with sneaky ways to accomplish their goals. On November the 30th, 2010, a document called Special Forces Unconventional Warfare was published. In this manual, you can find text that describes how to overthrow Iran and other countries. It starts off with putting sanctions on a country to create problems, or to amplify already existing problems. After that, you can then fund and train opposition groups, who can lead the charge in overthrowing the selected government. What you also do is apply propaganda to the public in the target country, make them accept an armed uprising and make them hate the government even more. Then you create boycotts and protests, so it looks like there is widespread resentment for the government, sucking in more people. If retaliation by the target government occurs, the resistance can exploit the negative consequences to garner more sympathy and support from the population, by emphasizing the sacrifices and hardship the resistance is enduring on behalf of the people. So it's no surprise that we recently have people like William Kristol, a co-founder of the Project for the New American Century, coming out for action against Iran. And it's no surprise either that we see the same line being taken by Donald Trump, who is owned by ultra-Zionists. Netanyahu also made comments on what has been happening in Iran. Quote, "The people of Israel and Iran will once again be great friends. I wish the Iranian people success in their quest for freedom. They seek freedom. They seek justice. They seek basic liberties that have been denied them for decades." End quote. What he means is that the people of Iran are not, quote, once again great friends, but once again under the control of Israel. He also fails to mention the massive protests in Israel against the corruption within his own government. The world will have to see what will happen over the coming years to Iran. And to sum it all up, during the administrations of Bush and Obama, Afghanistan was invaded following 9/11, Iraq was invaded after fraudulent claims about weapons of mass destruction, Syria was destroyed by terrorist groups funded by American money, and not to forget the problems Libya and Sudan have faced over the past years. Another country we want to mention is Russia. This country seems to be in an all-out economic war with the Rothschild global banking system. The international community puts constant pressure on Russia to make them bend to the global powers. They enforce boycott after boycott. After allegedly paying off all Rothschild debts and then banning the Rothschild family in 2016, Russia seems to be building their own national backup banking system. Putin has been quoted saying, "They do not own the world, and they do not have carte blanche to do whatever they want. If we do not challenge them, there will be other issues. We will not be bullied by them." End quote. Since Putin has been working to get rid of the corrupt money system, it is not odd that the Rothschild-owned media is unleashed onto Russia in an enormous smear campaign. As we just learned, North Korea is one of the few countries who are not under the control by Rothschild Zionist banks, and are therefore of great interest by those people. North Korea now finds itself as a target of an American military and media campaign. America started 81% of the war since World War II, and they are now provoking North Korea with all of its power. Donald Trump's forces are sailing around North Korea, claiming they are just doing exercises, while Trump himself is tweeting insults. We only hear negative information about North Korea. The media wants us to believe that North Korea is a big threat and a ticking time bomb, and that their people are treated badly. But are we actually sure that North Korea is such a terrible place to live? When people visit the country, they are under observation and are not allowed to travel freely, so we can't be sure that all the happy pictures we see are for real. But there have been some recordings from people who managed to get around without a guide, and have recorded footage on their own. We see normal work days, metros, schools, happy and healthy people. Of course, the regime seems to rule with absolute power, and North Korea looks like it is a few years behind. But keep in mind that it is hard to run a country when most of the world is applying sanctions. As late as December 2017, Nikki Haley, the US ambassador to the UN, called on countries to cut all ties, including trade with North Korea, and asked China to do more to pressure the country into abandoning its nuclear program, including cutting off its crude oil supply. Most people look at North Korea and think, poor people, they are not free. But maybe it's us who are not free and just live with the false reality of freedom. Maybe the only way to avoid being taken over by Rothschild banks is to close your country off from the outside world, so your people don't get brainwashed by the world's elite, who use tactics like the ones used in Iran, where they feed people with propaganda and turn the people against its government. It is true that North Korea has a large army and is researching nuclear weapons, but if your country is being harassed by the international community, with wars just around the corner, anyone would like to protect themselves. If the international community makes the claim that North Koreans are not free, then we can point at a whole list of other countries who suppress their populations too. We don't even have to travel far. Let's have a look at China. Articles have come out in the last few years about a new so-called social credit system. When this system is rolled out in 2020, every single Chinese person will be rated on several fields and given a score. This score can now be used by the government and companies to hire or not to hire. It will determine where your kids can go to school, where you can live, what hospital you can visit, and much more. People will be ranked on the following points: honesty in government affairs, commercial integrity, societal integrity, and judicial credibility. Obviously, a system like this can easily be abused by the government to keep people in line by threatening them with low scores, which will basically destroy their lives. We can all imagine that honesty in government affairs means to support the current government. People will be rated based on their friends too. If you befriend people with low scores, you'll be affected in a negative way. If those friends would post negative things about the government, you'll be judged too, which creates the situation where people will police each other. When a big country with an oppressive regime gets their hands on technology like this is what will happen. If you want to know how a system like this would work, the series Black Mirror has a really good episode about this. It is called Nosedive. Most Western countries may not have the freedom they believe they have. Take for example David Icke, who over the years has arranged world tour conferences, but in many cases his booking is either cancelled or his show is shut down. Ultra-Zionist groups do everything in their power to deny free speech to people like David Icke. When the Ultra-Zionists attack free speech in the name of the Jewish people, all Jewish people get tarred with the actions of the tiny few, when Jewish people in general don't even know it's happening. These Ultra-Zionist groups are not just the enemy of freedom, they're also the enemy of the Jewish people. They pressure our freedom of speech by putting lies out in the public to control the people's perception of reality and events, and to control the flow of information. David Icke once said that these ultra-Zionists act like how the Nazis acted in Germany. When the Nazis aimed for power, the Nazis would burn books, break up meetings, and flat out ban public meetings of anyone who was trying to put another view of what the Nazis was about. David Icke is one of the least racist people we have come across. He's not spreading hate, actually quite the opposite, but he is trying to understand how our world is being run. If you take a little time and listen to what he has to say, you will notice that he is never being anti-Semitic. In fact, he also sees the Jewish people as the victims of these ultra-Zionist groups. Freedom of speech is also being targeted heavily on the internet. Take for example net neutrality, which we just made a video about. YouTube, Google and Facebook are trying to silence people by either deleting videos and websites or pushing them so far down the search engines that unless you're really looking for them, you'd never find them. What are they trying to hide? Opinions and ideas that conflict with the ideas of the global elite? Parts of history perhaps that they'd rather not want people to ask questions about? The vilification of North Korea and to an extent Russia today looks very similar to what happened to Germany at the start of the 20th century. Like North Korea and Russia in modern day, Germany in the late 1930s kicked out most of the ultra-Zionist banks that were ruining the economy. In return, the international media and many governments started to be hostile towards Germany. We will now go back in time and go over many events that happened during the first half of the 20th century. We'll focus mainly on Germany, and we will also tell the story from Germany's perspective. It will hopefully become clear that history is written by the victors. The suffering Germany endured is largely ignored, while their crimes have been exaggerated. While we do show the events from Germany's side, we want to stress that by no means we want to portray Germany and the National Socialist regime as saints. The regime committed countless crimes, and these crimes are easily found in the many books, papers, movies and documentaries made about the subject. But we also want to stress that Germany was definitely not the only nation committing atrocities, which the mainstream media will often pretend. Not only is Germany's side almost never shown, it is also hard to research. We worked through pages and pages of conflicting information and tried to find the truth, or get as close to the truth as possible. Want the rest of the documentary to be eye-opening for people that are unaware about the many events that happened during the World Wars that are not very well known. We are trying to show that history is not as black and white as is often shown on television. This means that we don't want people to jump on any trains, whether it is the pro-German train or the pro-Allies train. Be open-minded. Understand that good and evil are not just two opposing sides of a coin, but a spectrum with million shades of grey in between. The world wars were not just global wars between the Axis and the Allies. They were wars designed with a much bigger purpose in mind. The establishment of a one world government that was financed and orchestrated by the Rothschilds and their secret organizations. The Illuminati was one of these secret organizations and was formed on the 1st of May 1776 by Adam Weishaupt. The Illuminati is an Enlightenment era secret society. The society's goals were to oppose superstition, obscurantism, religious influence over public life, and abuses of state power. Through these secret societies, the Rothschilds created the blueprints for Bolshevism in Russia, National Socialism in Germany, and for Zionism. Why did the Rothschilds and their Illuminati order do this? The best way to control the world is to make sure you have people on both sides of the conflict. War generates a lot of wealth, and by controlling both sides, the Rothschilds made even more money. The wars also brought them a step closer to their ultimate goal, a one-world government. This government cannot be set up in a few years. The world wars were just one step of this plan, and the global elite is still pursuing it to this day. We know that the Rothschild family is not at the top of the food chain. Other powers exist above them. However, these powers remain completely in the shadows. If you're interested in learning more about the Illuminati, we recommend listening to 3 audio fragments recorded 50 years ago and were initially recorded on LPs. They are called The Illuminati and the Council on Foreign Relations and were created by Myron Kuroval Fagan. As a final note, the following part about the World Wars is partly influenced by 2 documentaries, Adolf Hitler, The Greatest Story Never Told, and Hellstorm. We don't agree with everything in these documentaries, as we strongly oppose the way the Nazi regime ruled Germany, but these 2 documentaries do cover a number of events that are almost never mentioned. In order to understand the full picture, we'll step back to the year 1914. On the 28th of June, Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip assassinated Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, in Sarajevo. 1 month later, on the 28th of July 1914, Austria declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized its forces, and after ignoring a warning from Germany to stand down, Germany declared war on Russia. Russia requested help from France, who agreed. France wanted provinces back it lost during the Franco-Prussian War. Chemical warfare was used for the first time. Many millions of people died, and many more were left destitute and hopeless. All of Europe was now in ruins. Eventually, the victorious Allies would hold Germany alone responsible for World War I. The next 20 years would see the German population suffer terribly from the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles. The Germans lost huge pieces of territory and had to agree they alone are to blame for World War I. Germany had to pay massive amounts of reparations to the Allies, have foreign soldiers on her border, and was forbidden to unite with Austria. The Peace of Versailles is considered very unjust by the Germans and was designed to cripple Germany so they are unable to compete with the other nations of Europe. Hitler believed that the soldiers were not to blame for the defeat, but the communist revolutionaries and the parliamentary politicians. It feels like a stab in the back, he said. What was this great stab in the back? To answer that question, let's summarize a speech given by millionaire businessman and political advisor Mr. Benjamin Harrison Friedman, who was an insider at the highest levels with ultra-Zionist organizations and a personal friend of at least 4 United States presidents. He was also a member of the 117-man strong Zionist delegation that was present at the signing of the Versailles Peace Treaty in Paris 1919. Mr. Friedman said, quote, 2 years into World War I, Germany, which then was winning the war, offered Great Britain and France a negotiated peace deal, but German ultra-Zionist groups, seeing an opportunity, made a deal with Britain to get the United States into the war, if Britain promised to give Palestine to the Jews, unquote. The British government agreed, and using blackmail, the ultra-Zionists in the United States pressured President Wilson to join the war. The United States won the war for Great Britain and France. The British, as promised, signed the Balfour Declaration, which gave Palestine to the Jews. After the First World War, Germany quickly slipped into chaos. The nature of the Treaty of Versailles made it hard for the Germans to recover. The Allies demanded crushing reparation payments, and private currency speculators would now cause the German mark to plummet. It was total destruction of the national currency and wiped out savings and businesses, leaving ordinary Germans to starve. Communists seized many cities, including Berlin. Inflation and unemployment soon followed and quickly destroyed all hope. Crime was rampant, drunkenness and drug addiction were widespread, and suicide rates soared. The situation seemed hopeless. During the 1930s, Berlin became known as the cesspit of Europe. It was a dangerous and unfit place for any self-respecting German family to reside. During these early years after the war, the Zionists held great power in Germany. International Zionists with communist backgrounds had successfully embedded themselves into the German administrative system. Since 1850, they took control over large parts of the media and gained a powerful position among judges. Zionists had great influence in cinema, literature and culture. The ultra-Zionist banks were at the center of a lot of economic crashes in Germany between 1870 and 1920. In Russia, during the early 1900s, revolutionaries were busy plotting to overthrow the Tsar and establish their Bolshevik government. In order to do this, they needed money. The early Bolshevik leadership decided to rob a bank. Among the organizers were Vladimir Lenin, Maxim Litvinov, and Joseph Stalin. It happened on the 26th of June 1907 in Tiflis, a Russian city, with Stalin leading the robbery. These bank robbers got away with 341,000 rubles, nearly $4 million today, and killed 40 people and injured 50 others in the process. The stolen money was useless, since the serial numbers were known to the police. Ultimately, the bank robbery was a failure. The Bolsheviks couldn't use the money and now turned to the banks in Germany and America to fund their campaign. A report was released about the Zionist-controlled German banks who, under the leadership of Max Walberg, conspired as early as 1914 to send large payments to Lenin and Trotsky in their attempts to bring down the Tsar. As part of this conspiracy, Jacob Schiff, head of the New York Zionist banking house of Kunlub, invested at least 20 million, which would be around $500 million today, towards the establishment of Bolshevism in Russia. He was initially placed in the United States by the Rothschilds to gain control over the American economy and was now used to fund Bolshevism. In 1917, during World War I, Trotsky would often meet with Jacob Schiff in New York. One night, all of a sudden, Trotsky and about 300 of his followers disappeared from the United States. They boarded a ship headed for Switzerland, where they wanted to meet up with Lenin and his associates. On board of the ship was the 20 million Schiff had provided for the Russian Revolution. Lenin would throw a party and invite very important guests, among them Max Warburg of the Warburg banking house in Germany. Other notable guests, some Rothschilds, Kaganovich and Stalin. Keep in mind that in 1917 all these people were supposed to be enemies. The revolution started, the Romanovs were murdered and a Bolshevist party was established. Some of the most powerful leaders of Bolshevism were Jews. The following photo shows the first People's Commissariat. From left to right are Urinsky, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Sverdlov and Kaganovich. In fact, many atheistic Jews fill the communist branches. The National Archives of the American Embassy on July 17, 1918 noted, quote, "In 1918, intelligence services of the Western powers were buzzing with reports that communism was an international conspiracy fomented by atheistic Jews. British, Dutch, American and other intelligence reports confirmed that as much as 75% of all Soviet commissars were atheistic Jews." When the white Russian patriots tried to regain their freedom from Jewish communism, compact Jewish masses were used by Bolsheviks to suppress such a counter-revolution. Clearly, Bolsheviks and the native Russians were in a struggle for the future of Russia. The Bolsheviks won this struggle in the end. While doing more research into Bolshevism and whether or not Jews held a powerful position within the movement, we came across a lot of conflicting information. Looking through the Bolshevism wiki page, we find that only about 10% of members were Jewish in 1907. Going to the Jewish Bolshevism page, we read that the entire story about the Jewish majority in Bolshevism is a conspiracy theory, according to the wiki. Not only does the wiki page say that it is a conspiracy theory, talking about this is also anti-Semitic. However, people talking about this topic are talking about the Jewish leadership of Bolshevism, which in no way represents Jewish people. It would be similar to speaking out against Britain's imperialistic behavior and mistreatment of people and be told that you only say that because you hate white people, while in fact you are critical about the government and not the people. Why is it that the Jewish Chronicle on 4 April 1919 writes, quote, "There is much in the fact of Bolshevism itself, in the fact that so many Jews are Bolshevists, in the fact that the ideals of Bolshevism at many points are consonant with the finest ideals of Judaism." End quote. Another argument is that even Vladimir Putin says this.
Решение о национализации этой библиотеки было принято советским правительством, первым советским правительством, и членами его являлись примерно на 80-85% евреи. Но они же, руководствуясь ложными идеологическими соображениями, шли тогда на аресты и репрессии и иудеев, и православных, и представителей других конфессий, мусульман.
He mentioned the first Soviet government. This was a Bolshevik government under Lenin. It is understandable to think that something that happened over 75 years ago would be well documented and well understood, but this is clearly not the case. There's a lot of conflicting information and information is still being edited today. The ultra-Zionists did not only wield great power in Europe, but also in America. During these early years, the American media was founded and controlled by the following Zionists. David Sarnoff founded NBC in 1926. CBS was founded under the presidency of William S. Paley. ABC was an outgrowth of the NBC network with Leonard Goldson as its president. The media's illusion of choice is continuing to this date. Today, in 2018, we have 6 ultra-Zionist-owned media giants, which are controlling 90% of what we read, watch and listen. During these early years after the war, Hitler comes into the picture. After fighting in the First World War and feeling betrayed by his government, he joins a political party called the German Workers' Party. He quickly rises to the top and the party grows fast. He tries to overthrow the government in 1923 but fails. He is sent to prison where he writes Mein Kampf. After prison, he starts to call himself the Führer. He decides to get power through the polls and not another coup. Hitler gains 3 seats in 1925 and ends up with 107 seats in 1930. Hitler comes to power as the head of a coalition government. He quickly outmaneuvers the other members and establishes his own dictatorship. When Hitler assumed power in 1933, he ordered Berlin to be cleansed of obscene books, pornography and communist literature. Everything was burned by the National Socialists. The clampdown will force some Jewish people and liberals to leave for the US. Germany is basically a police state at this point. Hitler starts building motorways, bridges, canals, port facilities and housing units for the workers and their families. The workers then eagerly spent the newly earned wages, contributing to a fast-growing economy. Crime is virtually eliminated, with streets made safe to walk again. Priorities given to the health and fitness of the nation, especially the youth. Free healthcare and generous financial support are provided for expectant mothers. However, this was only the case if parents could prove they had Aryan genes. If needed, they could leave their children in Lebensborn homes, where the children would receive the best care and of course a Nazi education. The Lebensborn program, which operated from 1935 until 1945, was meant to reverse the birth rate decline and at the same time create a superior Aryan master race. Apart from helping mothers, the Lebensborn office had darker sides too. They even stole children. They kidnapped thousands of European children, and many of these children were from Poland and Slovenia. Any children who looked Aryan enough were abducted. These measures can be seen as part of the horrible eugenics program, which we will cover more in depth later in this video. Couples that would soon marry could get a loan of 1,000 Reichsmarks. The birth of one child meant that 25% of the loan did not have to be paid back. 2 children meant that 50% of the loan not need to be paid back. 4 children meant that the entire loan was cleared. Females were discouraged to wear makeup and high heels. They were also discouraged from slimming, as this was seen bad during childbirth. It is now government policy to protect the environment and wildlife. Hitler was a vegetarian and loved animals. Other top Nazi officials supported animal welfare as well. When Hitler assumed power, fox hunting was banned. Animal experimentation became regulated and anesthetics were now required in slaughterhouses. During the war, pictures would emerge of Hitler with animals, which would be downplayed as propaganda by the Allies. The Nazi stance on animal welfare shows an understanding that animals have feelings too, something that our modern-day world tends to forget. Hitler's political party looked upon the charging of interest on loans as immoral, and by forcing banks to abolish the practice of lending money at unreasonably high rates of interest, millions were freed from the slavery of debt. When Hitler assumed power, there were 7 million unemployed Germans, the highest per capita unemployment rate in Europe at the time. In only 1 year, 2,274,000 were helped back to work. It was a spectacular financial recovery, not witnessed before or since. Meanwhile, most Western countries were still mired in the Great Depression. On the 27th of February, the Reichstag is set on fire. The communists were blamed for the crime, but no one knows for sure who was behind it. This event, however, was very convenient for Hitler, as this paved the way for him to rule Germany with absolute power as a dictator. The same night as the fire, a list of decrees and laws was signed. The Reichstag fire decree permitted the regime to arrest and incarcerate political opponents without specific charge, dissolve political organizations, and to suppress publications. It also gave the central government the authority to overrule state and local laws and overthrow state and local governments. Looking back on history, did Hitler mistook the Jews with the Rothschild Zionist elite? The average Jew in Germany had little to do with the powerful Zionists, using banks to accumulate as much wealth as possible, and creating the State of Israel. Blaming these innocent Jews may have driven them to Bolshevism and Zionism, the actual enemies of Germany. The Nazi propaganda supposedly used the Jews as a scapegoat, blaming them for Germany's economic and social problems, and in March the 24th, 1933, after German hostilities against German Jews, the international ultra-Zionists united and declared war on Germany. They said every Jew should do their part. Together with this declaration of war came an international Jewish boycott of German goods. On the 1st of April 1933, Germany declared a one-day boycott of international Jewish products and demanded the international boycott to stop, or else he would continue his boycott too. The hostilities against German Jews and the anti-Jewish boycott were just the start. Anti-Jewish laws later followed in 1933. And here are a few examples. On the 31st of March, a decree of the Berlin City Commissioner for Health suspends Jewish doctors from the city's charity services. And on April 7, law for the re-establishment of the professional civil service removes Jews from government service. Growing anti-Semitism in Germany and by the German government in response to the boycott played into the hands of the ultra-Zionist leaders. Prior to the escalation of anti-Semitism as a result of the boycott, the majority of German Jews had little sympathy for the Zionist cause of promoting the immigration of the world Jewry to Palestine. Making the situation in Germany as uncomfortable for the Jews as possible, in cooperation with German National Socialism, was part of the ultra-Zionist plan to achieve their goal of populating Palestine with a Jewish majority. A group of ultra-Zionists was quietly negotiating an agreement with the Nazis to allow the immigration of German Jews and their assets to Palestine. That deal, reported in August 1933, was the Transfer Agreement, also known as the Havara Agreement. The agreement served the Zionist aim of bringing Jewish settlers and development capital to Palestine, whilst simultaneously advancing the German goal of freeing the country of an unwanted alien group. As a result, Hitler's government vigorously supported the immigration of the Jews to Palestine from 1933 until 1941, when the Second World War prevented further collaboration. It was a pact that allowed Jewish people to emigrate from Germany to Palestine with their wealth intact. Each Jewish person bound for Palestine deposited money into a special account in Germany. The funds were used to purchase German goods, which were exported to Palestine and sold there by the Jewish-owned Havara company in Tel Aviv. Profits from the sales were then given to the Jewish immigrant upon arrival, an amount corresponding to the initial deposit in Germany. The National Socialist government was the best thing to happen to Zionism in its history, for it proved to many Jews that Europeans were irredeemably anti-Jewish and that Palestine was the only answer. So what we are seeing today in Israel is nothing new. This has been going on since the Second World War, where ultra-Zionists are doing everything in their power to frighten all Jews to get to Israel. Was Hitler's economic miracle the real reason for World War II? Winston Churchill said on November 1936, quote, "Germany is too strong, we must destroy her," unquote. Hitler is forced in the late 1930s to view Jewish people as enemies. The Jewry, pushed by Rothschild Zionism, was engaged in a self-declared war against Germany, and this made them enemies within their own country. Hitler continued his plans to get rid of them. Together with an ultra-Zionist group called Irgun Zwei Legumi, Germany arranged to deport some 4 million European Jews to the island of Madagascar. This plan, however, was never fully accomplished. We often hear how Germany invaded other countries, but this was not always the case. When the Austrian people wanted to unite with Germany in 1938, German troops walked peacefully into Austria, while Austrian troops walked peacefully into Germany. The official name for this unification is the Anschluss, but it is also known as the War of the Flowers, because not a single shot was fired. Austrians later democratically voted to join Germany, and 99.7% of the population voted yes. In 1938, Czech violence against ethnic Germans in the Sudeten provinces in Czechoslovakia is on the rise. Sudeten Germans are forced to call for the reunification with Germany. Czech President Edvard Benes orders martial law on the Sudeten provinces, forcing a furious Adolf Hitler to demand their return. The Sudeten Germans are severely mistreated by the ultra-Zionist-owned state of Czechoslovakia. Hitler politically pushes forward and gets the Sudeten provinces annexed. For now, World War II is avoided, but Germany's opponents are not done yet. In a major address in October 1939, Hitler warned that if the pro-war faction, led by Churchill and the British government, prevailed, that the result would be a terrible, large-scale war that would be a catastrophe for everyone. Hitler said, quote, "In the course of history, there have never been two victors, but very often only losers," end quote. Ultra-Zionist organizations were very eager for war against Germany and did everything they could to get the United States, Britain and other countries to go to war against Germany. One of the stories carried out in the media was that Hitler and his so-called Nazi henchmen or hordes were doing everything in their power to take over and enslave the entire world. Potocki, a Washington-based ambassador, wrote in one of his reports in great detail about the immense war fever that was being sowed in the United States by the Zionist media. He said the media in America are nearly 100% in the Zionist hands and are crazy for war against Germany. He was alarmed at the way in which the Roosevelt administration was pushing for war. Roosevelt's leading diplomat, William Bullitt, was secretly telling the Poles to go to war with Germany, promising to back the Poles if war happened. He was giving similar assurances to the French. Problems had arisen with Poland over the access to the German territory of East Prussia and the coastal city of Danzig. Hitler, on several occasions, presented proposals to try and resolve both situations, but the Poles refused to seriously negotiate. Danzig was completely cut off from the Reich, while Poland continued to gain control over this important coastal city. With the support of Britain and France, Poland had no intentions for any negotiations. There is some debate about the events leading up to the German invasion of Poland. It seems even scholars can't get to an agreement. The Polish claim that the Germans were the aggressors, and the news about mistreated Germans living in Poland was nothing more than Nazi propaganda. Since we want to show the German side of the war, we'll explain the events how the Germans believe they happened. Polish border guards regularly opened fire at the fleeing Germans from West Prussia. Before the war even started, 80,000 West Prussian Germans were living in refugee camps inside Germany. Hostilities against ethnic Germans in Poland continued. The German Foreign Office released a book entitled Documented Polish Atrocities, showing dozens of graphic photos of victims. This book has since been removed from sale, but it depicted a full-scale slaughter of the ethnic Germans in 1939. Hitler faces a tough decision. Either he does not declare war and all ethnic Germans will slowly get slaughtered by the Poles, or he does go in and saves them, but risks war with Britain and France. This made Hitler decide to make a deal with Stalin. Germany will get West Poland and Stalin gets East Poland. Hitler warned Poland that if they continue to ruin Danzig economically and continue to murder Germans, this situation will no longer be tolerated. The Polish acts of violence against the Germans continue and would eventually include a total of 58,000 slaughtered, which forces Hitler to invade. During the invasion, the Poles continued their abuse against ethnic Germans. On Bloody Sunday, which was a sequence of events that took place in Bromberg between the 3rd and the 4th of September 1939, Polish militia and soldiers tortured and murdered 5,500 German men, women and children. It is claimed that these Germans were partisans, fighting against the Poles, but the Poles were also killing women and children, which completely undermines their claims of just suppressing German partisan activity. Poland had greatly underestimated the German armed forces. The tactic of attacking the enemy with great speed, known as the Blitzkrieg or Lightning War, is utterly devastating. Those found guilty of taking part in the brutal killings of ethnic Germans now faced death by firing squad. Hitler did not want a world war, he just wanted a war with Poland. Although both Germany and the Soviets invade Poland, war by the Allies is only declared on Germany. In March 1940, after the Russian invasion of Poland, the Bolsheviks carried out a massacre in the forest near Katyn village in Poland. 8 huge pits were dug, and heavy trucks brought in Polish army reservists, doctors and engineers. These Poles were shot and dumped in the pits. Relatives could not identify the bodies as they were unrecognizable. This act of violence was then blamed on the Germans. The truth, however, had to wait more than 70 years. In 2012, the world press reported recent findings on the Katyn massacre conducted by the US National Archives and Records Administration. It has long been suspected that President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill knew that Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had ordered the massacre. One thing the world press forgot to mention: Adolf Hitler is now officially exonerated of the Katyn massacre. While Germany did not commit the Katyn massacre, they did commit countless other atrocities. Anyone disagreeing or working against the Nazi regime was ruthlessly persecuted, especially the Jews. If Jewish people were not murdered or sent to concentration camps, their belongings were often taken from them. In Hungary, for example, a young George Soros, who is a Jew, had to pretend not being one. He went around with the Nazis collecting property from Jewish people. In the following interview, you can see his reaction when asked about his experience during World War II. The way he talks in this interview makes it look like he didn't mind taking property from Jewish people during the war at all. Events like this can shape a person, and this may explain why he can say things like this.
My understanding is that you went out with this protector of yours who swore that you were his adopted godson.
Yes.
Went out, in fact, and helped in the confiscation of property from the Jews.
That's right. Yes.
I mean, that sounds like an experience that would send lots of people to the psychiatric couch for many, many years. Was it difficult?
Not at all. Not at all.
Soros says the Asian currencies would have collapsed even if he hadn't been in the market. They were overvalued. He says people tend to follow his lead because he's been so successful.
I think that I've been blamed for everything. I am basically there to make money. I cannot and do not look at the social consequences of what I do.
Keep in mind that no one is just pure evil or pure good, and good and bad are just a perspective. We all affect everything around us like ripples in water. People who have grown up without love and empathy will most likely lack these traits later on in life. Today, George Soros is a major player in world politics. He and his organizations can influence governments and in the worst case, even topple them. His money funds a lot of opposition and protest groups. To him, it's all just business. It seems he doesn't mind when countries, because of his influence, tear themselves to shreds. A person that speaks out against George Soros is Frank Furedi. Furedi writes, quote, "Soros does not believe in the legitimacy of borders, nor in the authority of national electorates. Consequently, he feels entitled to influence and if possible direct the political destiny of societies all over the world." End quote. Soros acts as if his wealth entitles him to influence and alter the policies of governments all over the world. This criticism is met with the typical response. Because George Soros is a Jew, any criticism against his actions is labeled anti-Semitic. People working for Soros in his many activist groups even boast about them destabilizing countries, especially in the Middle East and North Africa. George Soros is fighting behind the scenes against Brexit as well, which he calls a mistake. He is funding activist groups in Britain in order to change public opinion. It seems that people are fine with Soros and also America changing and toppling governments. But when, for example, Russia does it, people cry in anger. In May 1940, in their quest to prevent Germany from claiming territory lost under the Treaty of Versailles, Britain and France refused any offers of peace. In reality, they are worried about Germany's rapid economic growth and will not suffer further German advancement. While French troops are mobilizing, more British troops are arriving in France every day. Germany has no alternative but to go on the offensive. On 10 May 1940, Hitler invaded France through Belgium. The tactic of blitzkrieg once again proves devastating. The French surrender shortly after. The same day, in a speech at the Reichstag, Hitler presented Britain with yet another offer of peace. Secret government documents reveal that the British received over 24 offers of peace between 1939 and 1941, but Prime Minister Winston Churchill refused. Churchill is aware that Britain cannot defeat Germany alone, and he will do his utmost to drag the US into the war. However, polls consistently show that ordinary Americans have no wish to be involved in what to them is yet another European civil war. In 1939, Roosevelt repeals the Neutrality Act, the act that makes the United States completely neutral in the war, and he starts to supply Britain and France with weapons. In 1941, Roosevelt freezes all German assets in the US, a violation of international law. The US announces an oil embargo against aggressor nations. $1 billion in Lend-Lease aid is sent to Britain. The US will eventually ship a total of $31.4 billion worth of supplies, the equivalent of $522 billion in today's money. The loans will take Britain 61 years to repay, with the last installment made in 2006. Hitler will now concentrate on the battle he believes will eventually decide the outcome of World War II. Hitler feels that not only Germany is in grave danger, but indeed the whole of Europe. He knows the horrors the Bolsheviks will bring. Rather than wait, after meeting with his generals, Hitler will now plan a preemptive strike against the Soviet Union in what will be known as Operation Barbarossa. A secret document signed by Soviet Chief of Staff Kirill Meretskov on 18 September 1940 revealed that Stalin was preparing to invade Western Europe on 10 July 1941 in a massive military offensive called Operation Thunder. Germany had invaded the Soviet Union with only 3 weeks to spare. Stalin is caught completely off guard as 3 million German soldiers invade the Soviet Union. Stalin orders that anyone who retreats from the front line is to be shot, as they are considered traitors. To understand Hitler's fears for Europe, we must first look at the Bolshevik regime and Stalin, the man President Roosevelt would affectionately call Uncle Joe. Stalin came to power on the death of Lenin and ruled the Soviet Union through fear and torture for almost 30 years. Stalin spent his first years in office consolidating his power. He managed to sideline Trotsky. In the name of collectivization, Stalin started to collect produce from all the farmers. Red Army officials also confiscate all farming equipment. The peasants were left with nothing to eat and nothing to work the soil with. Because of this, in the Ukraine alone, some 6 million people starved over the next few years, 2 million in Kazakhstan and 1 million in the Caucasus. Everyone who opposed Stalin's collectivization program was executed or sent to the gulags. Millions of people will have to work themselves to death in these camps. Like every communist state, the Soviet Union was unable to feed its own people. They had to rely on aid from the capitalist states. The leading Bolsheviks who took over Russia were not Russians. Driven by ethnic hatred, they tortured and slaughtered millions of Russians without a shred of human remorse. Bolshevism was the greatest human slaughter of all time, and one of the most brutal but not so well known atrocities in our history. It happened from 1918 to 1957 in Russia, with the killing of approximately 66 million Russian people. Hitler now forms the Einsatzgruppen units for the necessary removal of the die-hard Bolshevik leadership and NKVD that later became the KGB from all Soviet towns and cities. However, on hearing of the German invasion, many civilians would take immediate revenge on their communist oppressors and associated collaborators. Many Ukrainian civilians see the German army as their saviors. Dr. Ingrid R. Zundel, who lived in Soviet-controlled Ukraine, said, quote, "What was left of us was herded into cattle trains and shipped to Siberia. It was literally a matter of hours or even minutes till our turn to board. It was September 1941 when the German army overran the Ukraine and stopped the exiling and stopped the trains. It was to us as if the Lord had sent us his angels. My mother never stopped talking until the day she died about the wonderful 2 years when the German army came." Unquote. While Germany did commit a lot of atrocities during World War II, the Allied propaganda did make it seem worse. To put Germany in a bad light, the Red Army would sometimes go behind German lines and slaughter civilians while wearing German uniforms, always leaving a few survivors that could blame the murders on the Germans. The Red Army even edited pictures to twist the story even more. These pictures are still being used today to show how evil the Germans were. Take this picture for example. It is effective because it is placed completely out of context. We see a German soldier being friendly with the local, but on the faked picture, he is placed behind a dead woman. On the original, note the shadow from the local's head on the soldier, the round shape on his shoulder and chest. This is unchanged in the fake. The shadow should look more vertical and also the pole casts no shadow. This picture was a perfect one to edit, because of the shocked face expression of the kid in the back. So, even during World War II, pictures were being faked, and this continues today. The difference being that our technology came a long way, so this makes it even harder to tell fakes from originals. And this is being extended now to video, with modern machine learning and just a few pictures and recorded speech, which are by the way easily gathered online, since everyone posts everything online. People can now make that person say or do anything. In 1941, the German government is established in Poland. Jewish people must wear the Star of David on their arm as they are still considered enemies of Germany. A district in Warsaw, Poland, is turned into a ghetto. There is condemnation from the Allies over the Jewish ghetto. But around this time, the Allies were not much better. Here are a few examples of how the Allies were mistreating their populations. America had many black ghettos and was a country where black people were still being lynched and hanged from trees. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had time and time again resisted any Republican Party efforts to pass a federal law prohibiting lynching. Britain's record on human rights of the subjects in her many colonies was likewise cruel and racist. Winston Churchill served in the Boer War, when thousands of women and children were left to starve in British concentration camps. No one was ever brought to account for the many crimes against humanity in India, Africa, and Australia. In 1922, future President Harry Truman joined the Ku Klux Klan. In the years between 1929 and 1939, the US forced 2 million Mexicans out of the United States, of which more than 50% were born American citizens. In 1890, 1 year after the birth of Adolf Hitler, the final massacre by the US Army of the Indians occurred in South Dakota. With these examples and thousands more, it looks like it was a worldwide epidemic to abuse and mistreat people, but only Germany got blamed for it. On the 1st of August 1941, Roosevelt, still looking for a way to enter the war, forces an oil embargo on Japan, an international act of hostility. The result was Japan losing 75% of her overseas trade and 88% of her imported oil. Soon, there would be insufficient resources to continue the war with China. After 5 months of sanctions, on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor is attacked by Japan. The Pearl Harbor conspiracy theory is the argument that US government officials had advanced knowledge of Japan's attack. Several writers and retired US Navy officials have argued that various parties high in the US and the British government knew about the attack in advance. The speculation is that they may have let it happen, or encouraged it to happen, in order to bring America into the European theater of World War II via Japan. On the 8th of December 1941, the US declares war on Japan and officially enters World War II. Britain will declare war the same day. 4 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler announced that Germany would now be joining Japan in the war against the US. Germany started bombing military targets in Britain during the first year of the war, and after accidentally hitting civilian targets, the British retaliated. The British attacked Berlin the next day with a few bombers. After these events, the situation worsened. The Germans started the London Blitz, destroying large parts of the city and killing many people. By the end of 1940, German air raids had killed 15,000 British civilians. One of the worst attacks had occurred on the night of November 15 against Coventry, an industrial city east of Birmingham in central England. In that raid, 449 German bombers dropped 1,400 high-explosive bombs and 100,000 incendiaries, which destroyed 50,000 buildings, killing 568 people and leaving over 1,000 badly injured. The incendiary devices created firestorms with superheated gale force winds drawing in torrents of air to fan enormous walls of fire. Later, the Allies would increase their bombing campaign against German cities, and this escalated in 1943. After failing to take Moscow at the end of 1941, and with the German army in retreat, the German generals tried to turn the war around. They launched a counterattack in early 1942, which will eventually run out of steam in Stalingrad. The majority of the German army is forced to surrender, and this marks the turning point of the war. From now on, the Germans fight a losing war. During World War II, the Allies would conduct massive air raids against German cities, and the Allies called it carpet bombing. The German citizens suffering from its consequences would call it terror bombing. The bombing campaign was a plan created and organized by the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, also known as Bomber Harris. Their goal was to use the Royal Air Force to completely destroy all life in Germany. On the 24th of July 1943, in the middle of the night, 792 Royal Air Force bombers prepared for Operation Gomorrah, which would last an entire week. Their target, Hamburg. At the time, Hamburg housed around 1 million people. To inflict the maximal amount of casualties and destruction, the bombers were loaded with incendiary bombs, which would cause massive fires when detonated. Upon arrival, the bombers would unload their lethal cargo on the helpless civilians of Hamburg. Any building located in the blast zone would be set on fire and reduced to rubble. The horror from above continued throughout the night. When the dust finally settled in the morning, firefighters from all over northern Germany had arrived. In the middle of the chaos, the Allies returned to kill as many refugees and rescue workers as possible. During the next night, Allied bombers dropped an enormous amount of phosphorus bombs on Hamburg. This greatly increased the intensity of the already existing fires and merged them into one big inferno. Hurricane-level winds would rip roofs from buildings and people were blown in all directions. Due to the intense heat, the asphalt melted and people unknowingly ran into the street and got stuck. The temperatures in the middle of the fires would reach over 800 degrees Celsius. The Allied bombing of Hamburg would leave almost 35 square kilometers completely destroyed and over 750,000 Germans homeless. Hamburg would never be the same again. Hamburg was not the only city to be hit by the Allied terror campaign. This pattern was repeated again and again in Germany. Another city that felt the rage of Bomber Harris and his Royal Air Force was Dresden, also known as Florence of the North. Around 10 p.m. on the 13th of February, the dreaded sirens disrupted the nightly silence in Dresden. As Allied aircraft filled the skies above, bombs would fall like hail on the city. This time the attackers would bring a bigger type of ordnance, blockbuster bombs. These bombs could flatten an entire neighborhood. The ancient architecture suffered terribly during these attacks. Many old structures were removed from the face of the earth. The once proud cathedrals and palaces were now burning piles of rubble. After a brief but intense bombing raid, the explosions suddenly stopped and the nightly silence returned. Throughout the night, rescue workers fought the fires and helped the German civilians caught in the onslaught. Unfortunately for anyone still in the city, the Allies were not done yet. They returned in force and began the second phase of their attack. If the first attack was designed to cripple a city, the second attack was meant to completely destroy it. Using incendiary bombs, the Allies ignited damaged structures and rubble, creating a sea of flames that could be seen from tens of kilometers away in the center of Dresden. Most Dresdeners, still stunned from the initial attack, reacted slowly. With fires of these proportions, bomb shelters would be of little use. The thermal radiation would penetrate right through the door and walls and cook anyone hiding inside. People that ran through the streets trying to find a place to hide became stuck in the asphalt. The heat was so intense that copper roofs would melt and a rain of molten metal would cover the people below. The rescue workers would not abandon the civilians of Dresden this easily, and the next morning they would continue saving as many lives as possible. The streets were covered in bodies, all shrunk and charred by the intense heat. During the morning, it became clear that even open spaces were not safe. The Royal Air Force had purposefully targeted the squares and parks in the city, knowing people would flee here to avoid the fire. The scene was horrific, with torn bodies scattered everywhere. The people on the ground were once again surprised by the flying war machines. This time, the Allies also brought fighter planes to chase after any easy target they could find. Helpless women and children were machine gunned without mercy. The few animals from the Dresden Zoo that had survived the night were also killed. It is estimated that around 400,000 Germans died in the attacks on Dresden. In comparison, the atomic bombs on Japan would kill around 100,000 people. Almost the entire world was looking for the complete destruction of Germany. Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, would have to fight over 50 countries led by the Soviet Union in the east and Britain and the United States in the west. While addressing the current state of the war, which Germany was losing, Hitler said the following, quote, "The world must understand that the state will never surrender. The German Reich may encounter setbacks, but never will it stray from its chosen path. The German leadership shares the hardship endured by its people, but never will it surrender in the face of hardship." End quote. The first signal that Stalin comes not as a liberator but as a conqueror is seen in late July as General Rokossovski takes the eastern Polish city of Lublin. Within hours of the red flag appearing over the city, Stalin has installed a puppet communist government, the Lublin Committee. Angered nationalist Poles in London bring little response from the Allied corridors of power, and the Polish government in Britain is powerless to prevent this theft of its constituents. Churchill visits Moscow to discuss the fate of Eastern Europe, and he knows that there's little Britain and the US can do to stop Stalin, whose ambitions are backed by the vast Red Army. So the two leaders reach a pragmatic agreement on a piece of scrap paper. It concedes Soviet control over Bulgaria, Hungary and Romania, in return for Stalin's guarantee to not intervene in Greek politics. The future of Yugoslavia is left open, and Stalin refuses to even discuss Poland. After Stalingrad, Germany fought a defensive war. They were slowly pushed back. Dr. Ingrid R. Zundel, who lived in Ukraine, quote, "In 1943, the story changed and the Germans were pushed back, and in the pushback they moved us with them. We went willingly. They didn't move us at gunpoint. Had we stayed back, the communists would have taken us and executed us, or shipped us to Siberia. Food was getting short, the horses were getting sick, the road was getting narrow, and it was extremely cold. When the winter came, it became harder and harder. The army would confiscate houses and put the refugees there. The German army protected us to the end. They never let us down." Unquote. As the Germans keep retreating, the Soviet forces reconquered the Balkans in 1944. The mountain peoples of the Balkans, and above all Chechens, are rounded up by mobile NKVD units. Whole groups of innocent people are marked down for deportation. It is the tragedy of a small nation in the hands of a vast and ruthless state. They are dragged from their homes, leaving entire areas empty of any inhabitants. When German troops are driven from the Crimea in May, Stalin is convinced that the Tatar people have been guilty of collaboration with the Germans. Stalin dissolves the Muslim Autonomous Republic of the Tatars and deports 400,000 men, women and children to Siberia. With the Soviet war machine pushing the Germans back in the east, the Western Allies launch Operation Overlord on the 6th of June 1944. Hundreds of thousands of troops land in Normandy, France. They quickly establish a foothold and start pushing the Germans back as well. This sudden invasion brings a lot of chaos, and atrocities are committed on both sides. Both the Germans and the Allies kill unarmed prisoners. Even civilians are caught in the onslaught. On the 10th of June 1944, the village of Audore-sur-Glane in Haute-Vienne in Nazi-occupied France was destroyed, and 642 of its inhabitants, including women and children, were massacred by a German Waffen-SS company. This happened after a SS officer was allegedly captured by the resistance. While the Soviet Union pushes towards Berlin, the city is smashed by bombing raid after bombing raid. Germans, massively outnumbered, prepare for the defense of their city. Old men and kids join the defense of Berlin, still incredibly loyal to Hitler in the face of certain defeat. Stalin claims he has 6 million men, compared to barely 1 million from the Reich. The 19th of April, Soviet troops reached the suburbs of Berlin. On the 25th of April, Soviet and US soldiers unite south of Berlin. Defiant to the end, Hitler denounces Field Marshal Hermann Göring and SS Chief Heinrich Himmler as traitors for attempting to negotiate with the Allies without his knowledge. Stripping them of their positions, he hands over the leadership of the Third Reich to Navy Commander Karl Donitz. 2 days after marrying Eva Braun, it is believed that Hitler and Eva committed suicide and their bodies were burned. The 6th of August 1945, the atomic bombs are dropped on Japan. 6 days later, the hostilities between the US and Japan cease. This marks the end of the Second World War, but this is not the end of the atrocities committed against the German people. In late 1944, the so-called Morgenthau Plan was endorsed by Roosevelt, making the ultra-Zionist pre-war demand for German extinction official. Named for Roosevelt's Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, but conceived by the Secretary's top aide, Harry Dexter White, both whom were Zionists. The program called for the complete destruction of Germany after victory had been won. It granted complete Allied control over education and all licensed media, press, radio, television and publishing houses, until the year 2099. In addition to the dismantling and destruction of heavy industry, factories capable of producing electrical goods no more deadly than toasters, vacuum cleaners and hair curlers would be left. It also called for the permanent closure of mines and a reduction of the Reich's land by half. The Allies will now strip factories of machinery and plunder German inventions. In just 12 years, under Adolf Hitler and National Socialism, Germany had become the world leader in the fields of medicine, science and technology. It is the greatest theft of a nation's intellect ever. With 1,554 tons of patented documents worth billions collected and sent back to the US alone. Over 1,000 German scientists are taken back to the US with Operation Paperclip. Germany will be split up in 4 occupation zones: the US, Soviet Union, Britain and France. After the war, millions of German soldiers, officials and civilians are held in prisoner of war camps. The ethnic cleansing of National Socialists will now commence, with a witch hunt against German military leaders, political officials, industrialists and financiers. After the war, General George S. Patton, commander of the US Third Army, openly admitted the Allies had fought against the wrong people. He said about the Soviets, quote, "Let's not give them time to rebuild their supplies. If we do, then we have had a victory over the Germans and we disarmed them, but we have failed in the liberation of Europe. We have lost the war. If we have to fight them, now is the time. From now on, we will get weaker and they will get stronger." End quote. The media would now begin a campaign to discredit General Patton. He died in Heidelberg, in a German hospital, on 21 December 1945, due to complications from a broken neck he had sustained 11 days earlier in a minor automobile accident. No official report was made of the incident, and there was to be no autopsy. The post-mortem findings remain classified to this day. The leaders of the leading nations in the Second World War would eventually die as well. Joseph Stalin, real name Iosif Vissarionovich Jurgashvili, died 5 March 1953, aged 74. Stalin had collapsed amidst rumors he had been poisoned. Ultimately, he was the leader of one of the most murderous regimes the world has ever seen. The war crimes of Stalin are covered up and will only come to light when the Soviet Union collapses over half a century later. Franklin D. Roosevelt died April 12, 1945, aged 63 from a brain hemorrhage. Despite funding the war crimes of the Soviet Union and forcing America into the war, FDR remains one of America's most popular presidents. Winston Churchill died 24 January 1965, aged 90 after suffering a stroke. Although he is regarded as Britain's greatest statesman, he was an ardent supporter of imperialism, and he held views that were at least as racist as those of Hitler. He regarded English-speaking whites as a superior breed that would rule the entire world. Harry S. Truman died 26 December 1972, aged 88, after a complexity of organ failures. He will be remembered most for ending the worst war in history by the heinous act of dropping the atomic bomb on civilian targets in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And finally, according to official reports and eyewitness testimonies, Adolf Hitler died 30 April 1945, aged 56, while defending Germany. His name has ever since been a curse and a name not to mention anywhere. His name will instead be replaced with the ironic code word USA. This was confirmed by Winifred Wagner, daughter-in-law of German composer Richard Wagner. As unlikely as it may seem, some people contest the suicide of Hitler. They believe he escaped to South America. It is true that many Germans, Nazi and non-Nazi, did escape to places like Spain and South America. To this day, all over South America, German communities exist, with lots of links to the Second World War. Recently declassified FBI files report about Hitler allegedly traveling to Argentina by taking a plane from Berlin to Denmark, which still had German army units stationed on our airfields, and then from Denmark to Argentina. People have found an abandoned compound in the middle of the Argentinian rainforest, in a province of Misiones. The compound has been abandoned for quite some time, but did have German traces. The nearby area still has a sizable German population. According to some locals, during one night, some important Germans disappeared. If the FBI had files on Hitler and other Nazis fleeing to South America, did the FBI just leave them alone, or what happened? While most people know about the Holocaust and the crimes the Germans committed, less people know about the atrocities the Allies committed after the war. East Prussia was the first part of pre-war Germany the Red Army entered. From 1944 to 1947, what occurred to Germany in the last year of the war and the immediate post-year wars was a terrible crime. The fact that it remains a secret does not mean it is any less of a crime, but it probably was the darkest secret in world history. The massacres, the rapes, the starvation, the deliberate attempt to destroy a nation entirely. It is estimated that around 2 million women were raped by Russian soldiers from 1944 to 1947 in Germany. The evil swept in from the east, and after punching a hole through the German line, the Red Army suddenly burst into the Reich and swarmed over the countryside. After several days of desperate fighting, the German Wehrmacht regrouped, launched a furious counterattack, and eventually pushed the Red Army across the border. What German troops soon found was staggering. It was at Nemmersdorf where stunned soldiers first viewed hell on earth. Along the roads, fleeing refugees had been overtaken by the communists. The people were pulled from their carts, raped, then murdered on the spot. Men who had tried to protect their wives were knocked down and slaughtered. 50 French prisoners of war and Polish workers who had instinctively stepped in to protect the German civilians were tortured and killed. Staggered by the enormity of the crime, German authorities requested that neutral observers from Spain, Sweden and Switzerland view the sickening carnage close up. However, when the visitors filed their reports and word finally reached the outside world, there was only silence. By the winter of 1944, the vicious media propaganda against Germany had been won, and few individuals beyond the Reich's borders were concerned about tortured German babies or crucified German women. By the final months of the war, the enemy to be destroyed was not merely Adolf Hitler, the Nazi Party, or even the soldiers in the field. The aim of the approaching Allies was nothing less than the utter destruction of the German nation, every man, woman and child. Fueling the flames of hate was the Jewish Bolshevik propagandist Ilya Ehrenburg, one of the most influential men in the Soviet Union. Ehrenburg made sure his message of evil reached every soldier in the Red Army by ordering that leaflets be dropped from airplanes onto the front lines. Quote, "Kill them all, men, old men, children and women. Nothing in Germany is guiltless, neither the living nor the yet unborn. Kill, you brave soldiers of the victorious Soviet army." End quote. Ehrenberg would later win the Stalin Peace Prize in 1952. As soon as the Red Army forced the Wehrmacht back in the east, millions of German civilians suffered the same ghastly fate as the victims of Nemmersdorf. Although first encounters with the Soviet shock troops were truly traumatic, it was the second wave of soldiers who delivered hell on earth. In numerous instances, before troops continued their advance, they turned to the helpless civilians and warned, quote, "The Mongols are coming, very bad men," end quote. Terrified by the news, many Germans did attempt to flee. Most, however, found themselves trapped. Then, the dreaded second wave arrived, composed largely of Mongols and other Asians, as well as convicts. These men who formed the second wave of troops were regarded, even by their own comrades, as utterly merciless. Leading this group were the communist commissars, the fanatical political officers composed almost exclusively of Bolshevik communists. Quote, "The Russians were coming and going the whole time. They kept eyeing us greedily. The nights were dreadful, because we were never safe for a moment. The women were raped not once or twice, but 10, 20, 30 or 100 times. It was all the same to the Russians, whether they raped mere children or old women. The youngest victim in the row houses where we lived was 10 years of age, and the oldest one was 70. These atrocities were not committed secretly or in hidden corners, but in public, in churches, on the streets and on squares." End quote. Soon after the fall of Danzig, hundreds of desperate females pleaded with an officer for protection. The Soviet officer pointed to a Catholic church. After the women were inside, the officer yelled to his men and they went into the church, where the horror continued all night. Some women and girls inside, some as young as 8 years old, were raped more than 30 times. Little boys who tried to shield their mothers were shot. When Soviet soldiers captured the city of Neustädten in February 1945, they discovered several large camps of the Women's Reich Labor Service. Later, when the Germans recaptured the area, the German soldiers were horrified by what had happened to the 2,500 females who worked there. Quote, "We had never seen anything like it, utterly and unbelievably monstrous. Naked, dead women lay in many of the rooms. Swastikas had been cut in their abdomen, and with some, the intestines bulged out. Breasts were cut up, faces beaten to a pulp. Others have been tied to the furniture by the hands and feet and murdered. Women who tried to resist were brutally tortured to death. There was no mercy." So the women we liberated were in a state almost impossible to describe. The faces had a confused, vacant look. Some women were beyond speaking to, and they ran up and down and moaned the same sentences over and over. Having seen the consequences of these bestial atrocities, we were terribly agitated and determined to fight. We knew the war was past winning, but it was our obligation and our sacred duty to fight to the very last bullet." End quote. With the German army in headlong retreat, hordes of red soldiers swarmed into Greater Germany during the last winter of the war. As word of the Soviet breakthrough spread, millions of Germans hastily packed and fled into the freezing weather. Most merely packed farm carts, hitched horses or cows, and set off as fast as their animals would take them. Already bitterly cold, several days after the treks began, the temperature plunged. As a result, little children and infants died by the thousands. With the earth hard as rock, tiny holes dug in the snowbanks served as graves. Many women who tried to breastfeed their children froze their breasts. With chaotic conditions and freezing refugees clogging the road, many treks were quickly overhauled by the Russians. Some Soviet tanks crashed straight through the columns, crushing all in their path. Men, women, children, animals, all were pressed together as flat as cardboard. For millions of Germans cut off from the Baltic coast, only one avenue of escape remained, the sea. As isolated Wehrmacht units desperately defended their shrinking Baltic beachheads, millions of refugees poured into the coastal enclaves. With their backs literally to the sea, only the slow and treacherous evacuation by boat was an option. While many refugee ships successfully arrived at their destination at the other side of the Baltic, Allied bombers often intercepted these boats when they docked. At Swinemünde in northern Germany, the arrival of a freighter loaded with evacuees coincided almost exactly with an Allied air raid. Hardly had the ship docked when a direct hit sent it to the bottom. taking 2,000 scared passengers with it. On January the 30th, 1945, over 60,000 refugees crowded the docks of Gotenhaven, trying to board the Wilhelm Gustloff. At approximately 9 p.m., 3 heavy thuds rocked the Gustloff. At 10 o'clock, a heavy tremor ripped the Gustloff, and within seconds the big ship began to roll on its side. When rescue ships later reached the scene, they rescued around 900 survivors. Roughly 7,000 to 9,000 men, women and children were lost. As many more incidents would prove, the sinking of the Gustloff was no mistake. In a deliberate attempt to kill as many refugees as possible, Soviet submarines struck again and again at the slow-moving ships. Because of the horrors the German civilians had experienced with the Russian Red Army, many civilians ran to greet the American soldiers when they arrived. Little did the Germans realize that because of a decade of ultra-Zionist propaganda in the media, the Americans were perhaps even more hate-filled than the Soviets. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was leading the charge against the German people, and he was a man with a big hatred towards Germans. In much the same vein as Stalin and Roosevelt, Eisenhower advocated the outright massacre of Germany. The only good German is a dead German. Take no prisoners became the implied understanding. As in the concentration camps, the conditions in the German cities and towns were bad. Because of the constant air attacks from the American and British Air Force, very little food and almost no medicine was arriving anywhere in Germany at this time. Disease and starvation swept away the people by the thousands. When the Allies arrived at Dachau, for example, they found railway cars filled with corpses. A sign was bolted to the gate that read "No entrance, typhus epidemic." Upon entering the camp, the Allies found even more corpses. To the soldiers, these scenes confirmed the alleged atrocities committed by the Germans that were published by the Western media. The liberators immediately retaliated against the helpless German guards, who had been assigned to transfer the Dachau concentration camp inmates to the Allies. Abuse against surrendered Wehrmacht and SS units was fairly common as well. Many Germans assumed they would be treated with respect, but they were often shot or tortured shortly after being disarmed, or they would later die in the numerous camps set up by the Allies all over the country. Germany, like many other countries, had signed the Geneva Convention. This means that every captured German was entitled to food, shelter and medical attention. Even though the war was over, Eisenhower allowed and even encouraged the killing of many more Germans during peacetime. Eisenhower made the situation worse for the German prisoners by reclassifying them as disarmed enemy forces, or DEFs. Disarmed enemy forces did not have the same rights as prisoners of war. This meant that Eisenhower could treat the Germans however he liked. Like in modern times, the International Red Cross was stationed all over the war-torn area. They also had observers in the prison camps where the Germans were held. Shocked by the mistreatment of the German soldiers, the International Red Cross sent trains filled with food from Switzerland to the camps. Upon reaching the camps, the trains were stopped and ordered to go back. The death toll amongst German prisoners was enormous, compared to the amount of casualties sustained at the Western Front during the entire war. 10 times more Germans who die in the years after the war. In comparison, the Red Cross reported that the vast majority of American prisoners of war, around 99%, had survived and were returning home. Soon after the war was over, the crime trials at Nuremberg started. The story of abuse against Germans continues here. The accused often endured severe abuse, from blackened eyes and electric shock to broken bones and rape. Many innocent people were compelled to agree to the accusations so the torture would stop. Torture was not the only tool for obtaining confessions. Other methods include threatening a person's family or hire paid witnesses. These witnesses would say whatever the court wanted them to say. In England, out of view from the public, Germans were horribly abused by a unit called the London Cage. The British government denied its existence for years, but recent documents prove otherwise. The London Cage was run by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Scotland, and it was just one out of 9 similar units. While abuse in the West was horrific, the Germans that were captured in the East suffered even more. In Poland, many concentration camps were set up by the Soviet Office of State Security. Many Germans, without any form of trial, were rounded up and imprisoned in these camps. The camps were run by Bolsheviks and staffed by Poles, Czechs, Russians and former concentration camp inmates. Calling these places concentration camps would be inaccurate. They can be better described as vast torture chambers. The people running the camps found the most horrible ways to kill prisoners. Some were drowned in open latrines or locked in buildings and burned alive. Germans who were left alive faced horrific treatment as well. Some guards forced prisoners to crawl through excrement or kiss and make love to rotting corpses. Like in the Soviet-occupied area of Germany, many women were raped in the West as well. The raping was not limited to the German females either. The French had similar complaints about the Allied troops misbehaving. The food shortage in Germany made people desperate. Many females would trade their body for a piece of food or a few supplies. Some Allied troops wouldn't bother with trading, however. They would just take women by force whenever they pleased. Sadly, historical research has for years been dominated by the idea that rapes committed by GIs were implausible, because German women wanted to jump in bed with them anyway. Many American soldiers would later explain what happened towards the end and after the war. One American soldier said, quote, "Our own army and the British army have done their fair share of looting and raping," end quote. While the German population was left to starve, the Allies dined on the finest meals. Young children would search the rubble, just to find potato peels, breadcrumbs or dirty water. Many children would starve or freeze to death in the months after the war. Another danger were the thousands of unexploded bombs laying around everywhere. After the war, around 50,000 orphans would live on the streets of Berlin alone. The young girls learned that they could sell themselves for a piece of food. The children who could not adapt fast enough would perish. Roughly 11 million homeless Germans living in and around Poland now began trudging west, with no clear goal in mind, and then began the greatest death march in history. They would often get attacked and robbed during their journey. Many would travel with just the clothes on their body. Of these 11 million people, roughly 2 million would die of hunger and exposure. Another 1 million Germans would die after the war in similar marches in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria and Yugoslavia. Over time, people began to report about the large-scale mistreatment of the German nation. When all these atrocities started to come out, the Western leaders pretended to be surprised, but would ultimately do very little to help the suffering Germans. The Western authorities remained silent about the torture and murder of Nazi party members and SS troops. Like the German soldiers, more civilians died in the 2 years after the war than had died during the war. Some people might say that whatever happened to the Germans after the war was well deserved. Thinking like this does not solve anything and will just continue the cycle of hate in the world. While the Nazis did commit many crimes, the rest of the world would not be much better if they turned a blind eye to the suffering of the innocent German civilians. The problem is that a lot of this information is hard to find and many people simply don't know these atrocities even happened. The crimes committed by the Allies are not shown in the movies, on television or in books. The Allies have been hiding their crimes and have exaggerated the crimes of the Germans. Clearly, history is written by the victors. We can see this in our schools today. Young people are often not educated about our past. Or when they are, it is only the very basics. In an article that was published in the Daily Mail, Frank Freddy, a British professor, explains that in the early 2000s he first began to notice that fewer and fewer of his first-year students seemed to know what the Industrial Revolution was. A recent poll among 2,000 adults discovered that almost 50% of the people currently under their 30s believe Sir Winston Churchill was Britain's Prime Minister during World War I. Freddy was shocked to discover that 1 in 10 actually thinks Margaret Thatcher was running the country between 1914 and 1918, while 20% of them believe that Britain was at war with France, England's ally, rather than the Germans. Even worse, according to a poll by the military charity SSAFA, 6% said that World War II had been triggered by the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Clearly, we have been given a lot of misinformation about our past, and some information has been left out entirely. The new generation is learning almost nothing. Our history is slowly being deleted, so the new generation stays disconnected. When people are ignorant about the basics of World War II and history in general, they can't learn from the mistakes made back then. Young people are being bombarded with programming today, and it's not their fault that they lack this knowledge. While it is easy to point fingers at the politicians and the teachers, we should also look a few steps higher. We need to look for the powers that are creating the blueprints of what the new generations need to know. Like George Orwell said, quote, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." End quote. Eugenics started in America. It was the study for the creation of the perfect human. The American eugenics program was financed by the Carnegie Institution, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Harriman Railroad fortune. American eugenicists were determined to wipe away all human beings deemed unfit, preserving only those who conformed to a Nordic stereotype. Elements of the philosophy were enshrined as national policy by forced sterilization and segregation laws, as well as marriage restrictions enacted in 27 states. In 1909, California became the third state to adopt such laws. Ultimately, eugenics practitioners coercively sterilized some 60,000 Americans, barred the marriage of thousands, forcibly segregated thousands in colonies, and persecuted untold numbers in ways we're just learning. The most commonly suggested method of eugenicide in America was the lethal chamber, or locally, the public-operated gas chamber. Before World War II, nearly half of the coercive sterilizations were done in California, and even after the war, the state accounted for a third of all such surgeries. Even the United States Supreme Court endorsed aspects of eugenics, saying, quote, "Society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind," unquote. Only after eugenics became entrenched in the United States was the campaign transplanted into Germany, in no small measure through the efforts of the California eugenicists, who published booklets idealizing sterilization and circulated them to German officials and scientists. The Rockefeller Foundation helped found the German eugenics program. This means that the eugenics program in Germany started well before Hitler came to power. The German leadership committed many crimes in the name of eugenics during and even before World War II. For example, Heinrich Gross, an Austrian psychiatrist, killed at least 9 children that were deemed unclean by the Nazi regime. His role in hundreds of other related child deaths remain unclear. Another example is Action T4. This is the post-war name for the mass murder through involuntary euthanasia in Nazi Germany of over 70,000 people. People who were deemed incurably sick, this includes people with disabilities, were killed using lethal gas chambers in psychiatric hospitals. After the war, eugenics was declared a crime against humanity, an act of genocide. Today, eugenics is considered pseudoscience and racist. In the beginning of the 21st century, the governors of 5 American states issued public apologies to their citizens, past and present, for sterilization and other abuses spawned by the eugenics movement. But did the eugenics experiment stop here? We can find many clues that indicate our health is being threatened. Most of these threats come from the increasing number of chemicals in and around our food.
The World Health Organization carried out a smallpox vaccination program in Africa, and it said that the purpose of the program, forget smallpox, it said in black and white, in writing, that the purpose of these vaccines, which create infertility, was to eliminate, and I quote, 150 million excess sub-Saharan Africans.
Recent studies show that almost 90% of teenagers have gender-bending chemicals in their bodies. The chemical bisphenol A, or BPA, is used since the 1960s to make certain types of plastic. It mimics the female hormone estrogen and has been linked to low sperm count and infertility in men, as well as breast and prostate cancer. BPA is found in plastic containers, water bottles, on the inside of food cans, and in receipts. On March 20th, 1969, Dr. Richard Day, the National Medical Director of the Rockefeller-sponsored Planned Parenthood, told in a meeting of the Pittsburgh Pediatric Society that, quote, "a new world order would permanently transform the world." Dr. Day, who died in 1989, wanted to prepare the 80 or so physicians present. He talked about the goal of making boys and girls the same, a synthetic human, made in the lab. This synthetic human would replace normal humans and would not be able to procreate. The only way of procreation is in labs. Before we start, we want to state that transgender people are the victims. Not only is it likely that their bodies are filled with chemicals, they are also part of one of the biggest medical trials in history. Transgender people now find themselves in the middle of a hateful society. The following part is focused on the global agenda, pushed by the elite, and not at individuals who feel most comfortable being transgender. We now want to mention transgenderism, which is a topic that is not easy to talk about, because political correctness is being used to shield it from criticism. Political correct behavior is mostly used to silence other opinions. Instead of seeking dialogue, society has lowered itself to a level where we're not allowed to talk freely about important topics anymore. Political correctness is everywhere, and it is used to control people. Like we mentioned earlier in the video, it is impossible for the elite to control 7 billion people physically, but if you make them police each other by means of political correctness, this world becomes much more manageable to control. For instance, we know that people like George Soros own a lot of activist groups, and he uses these groups as sheepdogs. As long as these groups keep barking at anyone who steps out of line, the masses will keep their head down, not questioning anything. And soon, we probably don't even need the dogs anymore to keep us in line, as we will police each other. By creating social standards and broadcasting them over and over on television and radio, people will police each other and make sure everyone stays in line. People stepping over this imaginary line will be pushed back by the people around them. We all know how people behave to others who are different. Back to the topic of transgenderism. We know that every animal species is split into two groups, male and female. But this might not be the case anymore for humans, according to gender mainstreamers. Did they discover something that all the other animals could not come up with? Did humanity become too clever for its own good? In recent years, people claim that gender is the product of a biased society. Gender has no biological basis at all. Gender roles are being forced on people, and it's all simply a result of the way people are being brought up. We recommend watching a video by Dr. Peter Saunders, which is called the Transgender Agenda. At the start of this video, a reporter questions students about the difference between male and female. The students basically deny any difference between the sexes. Most of the students would even go as far as to say that gender is fluid, that it is simply a social construct. So that's the reality we're facing at the moment. A world where our young people no longer understand the difference of gender, or are not allowed to openly discuss it. Even politicians are afraid to stand up to these ideas, which doesn't bode well for our future. The charity group Gallup defines transphobia as intolerance of gender identity. Gallup goes on to explain that transphobia is based around the wacky idea that there are only two sexes. So if you're a believer in that idea, then you are transphobic. Even feminists and gay icons like Germaine Greer and Peter Tatchell get called transphobic and get barred from speaking in British universities, simply for expressing the view that trans women are not real women. Large-scale propaganda is carried out in our society. People are being pressured to adopt a new ideology and use a new language. The transgender agenda has been picked up by the media, television, movies, books, the internet and YouTube. And this means that a lot of young people are exposed to it. When Facebook tried to be politically correct, things got out of control very quickly. Over 50 different gender types were suggested, each with its own symbol. Another boost to the transgender phenomenon really came when it hit celebrity culture. For instance, when Bruce Jenner appeared on the front cover of Vanity Fair magazine in July 2015 as Caitlyn Jenner. The gender mainstreaming movement originally had its roots in radical feminism. In the past we had Simone de Beauvoir, and today we have Judith Butler, an American philosopher who is best known for her book Gender Trouble. Butler took Beauvoir's ideas a step further, and she denied the importance of any biological gender difference between men and women, and worked towards its deconstruction in society. According to Butler, there's no such thing as men and women. These sexes are simply a fantasy, something which we believe in because it has been repeated and forced upon us from birth. She calls these sexes a dictatorship of nature. The educational group Gender Intelligence helps children understand the distinction between 3 different centers in your body, the one for sex, the one for sexual orientation, and the one for gender identity. There's no one pattern that has to be followed. The change in perception on transgender people by the medical profession is profound. In 2005, this phenomenon was called gender identity disorder and is recently changed to gender dysphoria, going from a disorder to a state of mind. This change in medical understanding was mainly ideologically driven, rather than being evidence-based. Fast forward a few years, and general practitioners are now concerned about losing their licenses for refusing to prescribe hormones for gender reassignment. The medical experts are completely in their right. They know that hormone treatment can create all sorts of problems, yet somehow the widespread belief persists among the general public that gender reassignment involving hormones and surgery is safe. Perhaps the most important thing to mention is that giving children puberty-suppressing hormones so they can decide later what gender they want to be is one of the most widespread, untested trials going on at the moment. We do not know the long-term consequences. Theoretically, it could decrease fertility and bone growth. It could throw the hormones out of balance and it could cause cancer. It would almost be the same to compare to anorexia nervosa, a person who believes to be overweight but isn't. Psychiatrists certainly don't rush in and offer dietary advice. In this case, the specialists won't go along with the belief the person has. Sometimes people make the argument that intersex and transgender are the same, but it is not. With intersex, there's an abnormality due to a physical, biochemical, hormonal or structural error. This is totally different from gender dysphoria, where all these things are normal. Why do transgender people suffer from a much higher level of other mental health problems? Some say it's because gender dysphoria is a mental health problem in and of itself, and that it is therefore associated with these problems. Or because people who are transgender are so badly treated that they suffer from depression and anxiety. In the US, almost 50% of trans men attempted suicide, and trans women are roughly 10 times as likely to attempt suicide compared to the general population. There might be a plausible link between autism and transgender. Recent studies show that people with autism are much more likely to be transgender. Since we also have a huge explosion of kids with autism, what causes this? To answer that question, we would need to make another video, because that is too big of a topic to answer here. Just keep in mind that there is a huge gap between girls who like to play with cars and girls who are transgender. With this being said, it looks like the elite is succeeding in their push towards a one-gender human. Within a few decades, this will become normal, and kids will be confused about their gender from birth. The health of the average person is being attacked in many ways. Firstly, they're reducing fertility rates by putting substances like BPA in packaging and plastics. Secondly, it seems the media is dedicated to push families apart and destroy the family structure. With these two avenues of attack and many others, the hidden powers are trying to cull the human population. We can see this already with the plummeting sperm counts. In the last 40 years, sperm count has halved. This is why the amount of fertility clinics has exploded. With the launch of 5G in the near future and all the radiation the network will bring with it, this will only get worse. The radiation will also have an effect on the human mind and its ability to think clearly. If this continues, the end goal would be a world population of obedient, infertile, chipped sheep who do exactly what the elite tells them to do. Going back to pre-war Germany and their eugenics programs, it is hard to find direct information on how these experiments were carried out at the time. Before the war, Germany did most of the eugenics science in institutes, but as the war started, it's likely that at least some of the eugenics research was moved to concentration camps. That brings us to the Holocaust and its most known site, the concentration camps. These are the prisons where anyone that was deemed a problem to the Nazi regime was sent. While Germany had many camps, they were by far not the only ones. The world's first concentration camps were set up by the British in Africa. And in 1918, immediately after World War I, Poland built the first European concentration camps in the former German territory of Posen. During World War II, many countries built concentration camps. In the US, Americans with Japanese heritage were imprisoned only because of their background. Switzerland built concentration camps where refugees were forced to do heavy manual labor. Even Australia had concentration camps. The German concentration camps were used to imprison Jews, minorities, and unwanted people from the German Reich. The people imprisoned in these camps were used as laborers. They worked in the factories and made supplies for the German war effort. During World War II, huge typhus epidemics spread over the warring countries. Typhus killed hundreds of thousands of people in this period. Untreated typhus would have serious effects on the body, as typhus causes inflamed blood vessels, which in turn can cause a dramatic drop in blood pressure, as well as internal bleeding. Patients who suffered from typhus may also have experienced kidney failure or swelling of the liver and spleen. Typhus is carried by lice, and the new prisoners had them as well. In order to combat typhus epidemics in the concentration camps, new prisoners were deloused. Their hair was cut, they were washed, and they got clean uniforms. The dirty clothes were then fumigated in special small gas chambers to kill the lice. The Germans primarily used the poison Zyklon B and steam to kill the lice.
As this happens to be a case of old world typhus fever, which is known to be spread by the body louse, the contacts, those who have had association with the patient during the voyage, are first taken to the delousing plant. Here they must remove all of their clothing. Thoroughly sprayed with soap and water. Next they are sent under the shower. And finally, each one is sprayed with an insecticide that kills any lice or nits that may still remain in their hair. The clothing of these contacts is placed in net bags, and these bags are sent to the fumigating room. This clothing, together with the baggage of the contacts, is placed in fumigating chambers where it is thoroughly disinfested. If necessary, the contacts are isolated in the detention hospital for observation. Every precaution is taken by the quarantine officers to prevent the introduction of disease into the United States.
While the stories about gas chambers masked as showers are plenty, it is important to understand that the majority of camps had legitimate shower rooms for the new prisoners and small gas chambers for their clothes, in order to stop typhus from entering the camp. In fact, all camps in the West were set up like this. As far as we could find, no mass gassings happened in the West. They all happened in the East, in the so-called death camps. The big gas chambers that murdered many people we hear so much about were located in the East, in camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka and Sobibor. Upon liberation of the concentration camps, the Allies would walk into camps filled with corpses and starved people. While the prisoners were certainly mistreated, do keep in mind that towards the end of the war, the German infrastructure was completely destroyed. By the end of the war, the constant supply of food, delousing agent and other supplies had come to a standstill. This means that typhus and starvation swept over the camps in the months before the Allies arrived. As we can imagine, the situation in German concentration camps was far from perfect for the prisoners, even before the scarcity of supplies. People were split from their loved ones, had to work all day and lived in fear. Without a doubt, the concentration camps saw their fair share of abuse towards the prisoners, with beatings and murders occurring regularly. However, the Red Cross had observers stationed in the camps and they often sent group delegations in to inspect the conditions. Suddenly, in 1997, the Red Cross apologized to Israel for keeping quiet during the Holocaust and now claims the Nazis had cleaned up the camps in readiness for their visits. World War II is and has been portrayed as the good war, a war between good and evil and a necessary war. Since 1945, American presidents have repeatedly sought to justify US military actions in foreign countries by recalling the so-called good war, and in particular the US role in defeating Germany. If there is one truth that was born of World War II, it is that clearly there is no such thing as a good war. Those who say differently are either those who profit politically or financially. We can see an example of this in Germany after the war, where the Russians stole a lot of wealth from Eastern Europe and caused a lot of tension. In 1961, the Soviet Union closed its border and inflicted more misery on the people of Eastern Germany. Freedom to travel to the West for millions now living under communist occupation is forbidden. These restrictions and others become known as the Iron Curtain. The puppet government of East Germany will build the Berlin Wall, consequently cutting off 19 million Germans from family and friend. Many risked their lives in a desperate bid to reach West Germany. In 1989, as communism is collapsing in the Soviet Union, many in Eastern Europe will seek refuge in Western embassies. After 28 years of division, pressure mounts on Eastern German authorities to open their borders. Most outside Germany believe that the country is once again whole, when in fact it was only Central Germany that was reunified on 3 October 1990.
At the heart of Europe tonight, at the Reichstag, the German parliament in Berlin, the rebirth of a nation. East and West Germany become simply Germany again. Finally, formally, come together with the more than 60 million people of the West. And they listen tonight at midnight there to the Freedom Bell cast in the image of the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. And the flag which had only flown over West Germany now flies over a unified nation.
The Eastern Territories, as defined by the Allies at the Potsdam Conference in 1945, still remain under Polish and Russian control. One thing we can say for certain is that World War II was not a victory for European culture or Western civilization. At the end of the war, Europe, for the first time in its history, was no longer master of its own destiny, but was instead under the domination of two great outer European powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, which for political and ideological reasons had no special interest in or concern for European culture or Western civilization. The United States and the Soviet Union openly proclaimed that their goal after the war was to create a new world order. A society that's not capable of maintaining any specific cultural, ethnic, racial or religious character, since it's easier to control people if they all live by the same culture. It's no coincidence that we in recent years have seen mass migration over Europe. Europe, and especially Western Europe, is rapidly losing its European character. In the newspaper The Jewish World, Rabbi Baruch Efrati says that the Islamization of Europe is a good thing, and he says, quote, "Jews should rejoice at the fact that Europe is paying for what it did to us for hundreds of years by losing its identity. There shall be no remnants and survivors from the impurity of Christianity," unquote. Many British war veterans share concerns about the current state of Britain. Peter Hitchens, a British journalist, wrote an article in the London Daily Mail that complains about the long-term consequences of World War II. A growing number of war veterans now think that their sacrifices were made for nothing, and they are saying, "Why did we bother?" David Irving once made a similar point. He said, quote, "If the British soldiers on the beaches on Normandy in 1944 could look forward to the end of the 20th century and see what England has become, they would not have bothered to advance another 40 yards up the beach." End quote. Germany finally cleared its World War I debt in October 2010. It amounted to a total of 22 billion. In 2009, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel apologized for the invasion of Poland and all the atrocities the invasion brought with it. With a little research, one can understand that Germany is not alone to blame for the outbreak of World War II. And again, atrocities were committed on both sides. How many years must a country apologize for the actions of a minority of a former generation? Besides, if Germany has to apologize, why shouldn't all the other countries do the same? Even after 70 years, did Germany not get all of its land back, and never has there been a real peace agreement. It can be hard to understand why the soldiers did those horrible things. We found an experiment which maybe can explain why people do things they never thought they would do. A social psychologist, Stanley Milgram, who researched the effect of authority on obedience, concluded that people obey either out of fear or out of desire to appear cooperative, even when acting against their own better judgment and desires. Milgram selected participants for his experiment by newspaper advertising for male participants to take part in a study of learning at Yale University. The procedure was that the participant was paired with another person and they drew lots to find out who would be the learner and who would be the teacher. The draw was fixed, so the participant was always the teacher and the learner was one of Milgram's researchers. The learner was taken into a room and had electrodes attached to his arms, and the teacher and the researcher went into a room next door that contained an electric shock generator and a row of switches marked from 15 volts, slight shock, to 375 volts, danger, severe shock, to 450 volts, which is very dangerous. The learner was strapped to a chair with electrodes. The teacher is told to administer an electric shock every time the learner makes a mistake, increasing the level of shock each time. There were 30 switches on the shock generator, marked from 15 volts, slight shock, to 450, danger, severe shock. The learner, which was an insider, never received any shock, and his yelling and mourning was pure acting. But the teacher didn't know this before the experiment. 65% of participants, i.e. the teachers, continued to the highest level of 450 volts. All participants continued to 300 volts. Whatever the reasons for war, whether it is Germany trying to unify Europe against the Soviet Union, whether it is the Allies trying to stop the Axis powers, whenever nations sink to the point where it becomes acceptable to mass murder innocent civilians and soldiers who have surrendered, your cause for war becomes irrelevant. If you fight a regime that is killing innocent people by attacking that nation's innocent people, you are as immoral as the forces you are fighting. Countries can't claim to have the moral high ground and at the same time kill millions of people that have nothing to do with the war. We would like to take a moment for all the people who died, no matter the country, the race, religion, or which political party they belong to, and demand that nothing like this ever happens again to anyone, anywhere. However, in order to prevent this from happening ever again, we need to learn and understand our past.
Knowledge is power. Nothing in this world works as we think it does. As long as we don't understand how things work, we can't do anything about it. Jordan Maxwell.
So, what can we do about this? It all starts with yourself. Take responsibility for your life and your actions. Fight for freedom of speech. And be open to ideas from other people. Respect each other. Don't let a person's religion, color, nationality or language be a barrier. Don't let yourself be pushed into a group that hidden powers created to separate people. Next, question your government. Demand that your food is grown without GMOs, that the water you drink is clean and contains no chemicals, and demand that the items we use every day don't contain chemicals either. Ask questions, talk with people. Don't close your eyes and pretend the world is doing alright. If you want a future for your kids and your grandkids, a future where people are free and not controlled and spied upon, then it is time to take action.